I'll officially call the special meeting to order at 1 p.m. If we would please have a roll call from our interim city clerk.
Yes, sir. Councilmember Berg.
Here.
Councilmember Hensley.
Here.
Councilmember Sharkey. Mayor Pro Tem Schnapp.
Here.
And Mayor Fig.
Here. So we have an agenda. Do I hear a motion for approval?
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
So approved. Brings us to open forum. I only see one unfamiliar face out in the audience. If you're here to speak to us on anything that's not on our agenda, now's the time to do that. On the other hand, if you're here to speak on this issue at hand, which is the water rate study, then I would suggest if you could please fill out a card in the back, and then when we get to a point in the discussion that would seem appropriate, I'll certainly invite you up. Okay, so with that, we'll do
we say the Pledge of Allegiance, or do we leave it because it's not here?
it's not here. I'm always assisted by saying, well, you skipped over that, but I don't see it here. All right, so this is a rather informal affair. It is a workshop, which means there's going to be a lot of interaction. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Villafana. Or unless Mr. Butler, did you want to make any introductory remarks?
So we've got 3 presentations today. We're going to try to keep those reasonable to a reasonable amount of time so that we reserve enough time for all your questions and discussion. We'll start out with Director Don Villafana, then Mr. Hickox, Deputy Director of Public Works will be coming up, and then Steve Gagnon from Raftalis will wrap up with some more detailed information on the rate study. So we'll go to Don first.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council, staff. We're going to start this afternoon with a little background on our water system. And what this is, let's see. Okay. This is the City of Port Hueneme Water Atlas with the age of the pipe. And it's color-coded, but I want to give you a little facts on our water system. The City of Port Hueneme's domestic water system consists of the following: 47.3 miles, that's 249,489 feet of piping ranging in size from 2 inches to 14 inches in diameter, 2 12-inch potable water supply connections to the 24-inch diameter Port Hueneme Water Authority line, 1 closed pressure zone, 2 standby wells, and 1 that is inactive, 4 emergency connections to adjacent agencies, and approximately 393 fire hydrants, and approximately 5,648 potable water service connections. Here's some more facts. Approximately 26% of the system was installed before 1960, 30% during the 1960s, and 22% in the 1970s. Currently, approximately 23,590 feet of the pipe are older than the recommended useful life. That's approximately 9.5%. Another 13,295 feet, approximately 5.5% of the pipe, will reach the end of the useful life within 10 years. Now, this was back in 2011 when the Water Master Plan was done, so you can add almost 7 more years to that. Here's the color code that you're going to be seeing. 1940, that was steel pipe. 1950, AC pipe, all the way through 1980. And the AC pipe is asbestos cement pipe. Then in the 1990, we started using a heavy PVC pipe. That's the C900. This map is a overall of the city. And I'm going to zoom in here, and it'll show the various locations. The following slides you'll see are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they represent different parts of the city. But this is the overall showing you that. This is slide 1. You can see this is Victoria and Channel Islands Boulevard. The majority of the pipe there is AC, asbestos cement pipe, put in the 70s. And you can see the other type of pipe. You've got some that's varies in age. You've got some purple areas there and some brown areas. So go down one more time. This is another slide. This is Channel Islands Boulevard. Again, you can see where our pipe is and the age of the pipe. You've got you know, a lot of pipe in there that is pre-1970 and a lot of it's 1960s vintage. Here you go. We've got the middle portion barred to Bryce Canyon, and you can see barred at the bottom and Ventura Road. And if you look at Ventura Road, you see a green line, and that green line, as you look at the top of the water age little box, that's 1940. That's a ductile iron pipe. That's a 14-inch pipe that's in Ventura Road. Here's the next slide. Again, you can see Pleasant Valley and Ventura Road, and again, that main water line, that's a 14-inch diameter line, and then a lot of the other pipe in there is circa 1950. Here's the other slide. You see Hueneme Road. You're starting to see some of the older areas there. You see a lot of green. You see a lot of blue in there, some purple. You can see that we've got some older pipe in those areas. This is down by the beach. You can see, you know, that's when the Surfside complexes were constructed in the 1970s, and you can see that most of the pipe is circa 1970s in there. All right, that gives you a little background on what where we are with the Water Atlas. Let's see, okay. And now we're going to go to the Water Master Plan. All right, this is the Water Master Plan, and it was prepared by AKM Consultants, and it was the city contracted with AKM Consultants back in 2010, 2011 to prepare the Water Master Plan. AKM is a consulting firm that specializes in water projects. They've done numerous water master plan studies throughout Southern California. In our own county, they've done Camarillo, they've done, I believe, Rancho Palos Verdes and a number of other cities, but locally, Camarillo was another one of their clients. And I have it's very voluminous. If you want to see the entire master plan, I can provide CDs for you, or I can break it up into a series of emails to you, PDFs. I could not email the entire CD to you at one time, but I can break it up. So if any of the council member, or if all the council members would like that, or any of the public would like that, I can provide that if requested. And what I've done here is I've taken the Water Master Plan, and I've taken some key points from the executive summary, which is section 1, and then the capital projects section, which is section 9. And it really gives us some background on where we are with our water system. And let me blow this up for you. Let's see, where's Zoom? All right, here it is. The executive summary, the objective of this master plan is to evaluate the city's water system and provide a framework for the undertaking, the construction of new and replacement facilities for serving the water supply and distribution needs in an efficient manner. This water distribution master plan report presents the methodology, the analysis, findings, and recommendations of a comprehensive study of the city of Port Hueneme's potable water system and describes the water system supplied by Port Hueneme Water Agency. As a planning document, and it is in general in nature and predicated upon the best information available at that time, which was 2011. And let's see, what else did I have highlighted there? Nothing else. Okay. The next slide. This is, let me blow this one up also. This, again, is just restating the what our water system is. You know, over 47 miles of pipe, talks about the size of the pipe, talks about that we have 393 fire hydrants. So we just covered that in the water atlas, but I got that information, both it's repeated here and it's in the water atlas also. So that just describes again what we have. Again, approximately 5,684 potable water service connections. Okay, the transmission and distribution system, again, we're talking about that we have over 47 miles of transmission line of pipes, and that we have two 14-inch diameter pipes. And again, it gives the size. It also talks about the amount of pipe that, that was 1940s, pre-60. So again, it tells us the amount of pipe that's placed and the age. We also have 4 emergency connections. Those are to the city of Oxnard. But the main point here, then I've highlighted that in green, it's important to note that those interconnections should not be relied on as a primary source of supply for water, but only used in an emergency. And that's one of the key points there. And then the service criteria, the performance criteria is established to evaluate the adequacy of various water system components throughout the systematic analysis. Necessary improvements are identified and recommended for inclusion in a capital improvement program, a CIP. For the city, these criteria are generally in accordance with the California Code of Requirements, Title 22. Other criteria such as water quality, fire protection, are based on federal and state and local jurisdiction requirements. Basically, Ventura County Fire Protection District, which is who we contract with here at the city for fire protection. Let's go to the next slide. All right. Some key points here. Okay, maximum day demand plus fire flow. The maximum day plus fire flow run resulted in many deficiencies. Failure to meet the model junction pressure of 26 psi. The deficiencies are primarily located in the northern portion of the city, generally due to a system bottleneck caused by the undersized water pipes located in Ventura Road and Channel Islands Boulevard and feeding the northern portion of the city. The existing system is incapable of providing the maximum day demands and the fire flow to the northwesterly portions of the city. And that's really the key point in that slide.
Yeah, Mr. Fun, as we look at that, can we assume that's the same condition for Channel Islands Beach District?
I'm not 100% sure, but I assume so because we're a combined system.
Right, thank you.
All right, the transmission and distribution system. The critical point in the city's system is on Ventura Road between Sunkist and Channel Islands Boulevard, where the existing 14-inch ductile iron pipe is the only facility that conveys water to the northern portion of the city. That's the pipe that was shown in green, which was circa 1940. The useful life of the city's water facilities are discussed in section 7.9. Currently, approximately 23,590 feet of the pipe are older than the recommended useful life. Another 13,295 feet of pipe will reach the end of its useful life in the next 10 years. The estimated or the useful life is typically 70 years. That green pipe, that 14-inch ductile iron pipe, was put in circa 1940. If you use 1945, I don't know the exact date it was installed, but we're looking at a pipe that's older than 70 years old. Okay. The capital improvement program, The capital improvement program, CIP, consists of projects that will enhance the system to meet the established criteria, properly maintain the system's assets, and replace the facilities that have reached the end of their useful lives. The goal of the CIP is to provide the city with a long-range planning tool that will allow construction of the recommended projects in an orderly manner to improve the existing system and provide for any future growth. In order to accomplish this goal, it's necessary to determine the estimated cost of the needed water system improvements identified in this report, established a basis, and prioritized each of the projects. The recommended CIP is shown in Table 1.4, and the projects are shown in Figure 1.1. And we're going to go on from there. Okay, the capital project section. These are the key points out of the capital project section. The goal of the CIP is to provide the city with a long-range planning tool that will allow construction of the recommended projects in an orderly manner to improve the existing system and to provide for any future growth. Project priorities. The primary consideration in establishing project priorities for the capital improvement program must always be given to the health, the safety, and the welfare of the public and the customers. The number one priority, as outlined in the Water Master Plan, was Project 1, construct 24-inch water main in Ventura Road North and construct pipes at various locations to complete the loop, approximately 4,000 feet. There is currently a bottleneck between the northern and southern portions of the city. A single 14-inch ductile iron pipe located in Ventura Road between Sunkist Avenue and Channel Islands Boulevard is undersized and cannot provide the required fire flow to the northern portion of the city. The facility was constructed in the 1940s and is near the end of its estimated useful life. It is recommended to replace the existing 14-inch water main with a 24-inch pipe or equivalent parallel pipes to provide the required fire flow to the north. The second priority was construct a 24-inch water main on Ventura Road South, just under 5,000 feet. The existing ductile iron pipe, that's that 14-inch line, was constructed in the 1940s and will reach the end of its estimated useful life in 2020. And this was put together in 2011. 2020 is right around the corner. The third priority was construct 18-inch water main on Channel Islands Boulevard East, approximately 3,800 feet. So that's the existing asbestos cement pipe on Channel Islands Boulevard between Ventura Road and Victoria Avenue, generally supplies the northwest portion of the city. The water main is interconnected with smaller 6-inch and 8-inch pipes. The existing main is unable to provide the required fire flow to the commercial developments in the northwest portion of the city. And they'll show you, they talk about Victoria and Channel Islands. The pipes were constructed in the 1960s and will reach the end of their estimated useful lives by about 2035. Project 3 recommends increasing the existing 12-inch water main on Channel Islands Boulevard to 16 between Ventura Road and Patterson. And they give these costs. They gave some estimated costs, but please bear in mind that was circa 2011. So you'd obviously have to supply a multiplier to that. The fourth project was construct a 16-inch water main on Channel Islands Boulevard West, just over 4,300 feet. Project 4 extends west to the end of project number 3 to Victoria. The water main is generally interconnected with 6- and 8-inch water pipes. The pipes were constructed in the 60s and will reach, blow this up. Oops. Excuse me here, the mouse is, there we go. Okay, there we go. The end of their estimated lives will be 2035, and those were the lines we were talking about previously. The existing mains are unable to provide the required fire flow to the commercial developments in the northwest portion of the city. The existing 12-inch water main is recommended to be increased to 18-inch on Channel, or 16-inch on Channel Islands Boulevard between Patterson and Victoria, and again, they give an estimated cost, but those were back in 2011. The fifth project is construct a 10-inch water main on Joyce Drive, Ann Avenue, and Jane Drive, just over 2,500 feet. The existing 6- and 8-inch pipes on Joyce Avenue and Jane Avenue are considered a bottleneck and cannot provide the required fire flow to the medium-density residential complex located in the vicinity of Port Hueneme Road and Courtyard Drive. The existing pipes connect the 12-inch water main at Willowbrook Drive and Joyce Drive to the 10-inch pipes at Courtyard Drive and Port Hueneme Road. The majority of these reaches were constructed in the 1950s and 60s. It is recommended that the pipe be increased to 10 inches in diameter to remove the bottleneck and provide the required fire flow to the aforementioned medium-density residential complex. And again, they give an estimated cost, but those were back in 2011 dollars. Project 6, construct a 12-inch water main on Port Hueneme Road, just over 3,900 feet. The existing 6-inch and 8-inch water pipes on Port Hueneme Road are considered a bottleneck and cannot provide the required fire flow to the Surfside 3 high-density residential development. The majority of the supply to Surfside is provided through a 10-inch facility on Ventura Road and Surfside Drive. To increase redundancy and to provide the required fire flow to this residential complex, it is recommended that the existing pipes along Port Hueneme Road between Ventura Road and Surfside Drive be increased to 12 inches in diameter. The cast iron pipes were generally constructed in the 40s and have reached the end of their estimated useful life. Project 7, construct an 8-inch water main on Seawind Way and Lighthouse Way, just over 600 feet. The existing 8-inch asbestos cement pipes on Seawind Way and Lighthouse Way act as a bottleneck to the Surfside 3 high-density residential development. These pipes were constructed in the 1970s to provide the required fire flows. The 6-inch pipes are recommended to be increased to 8 inches. Project 8, pipes beyond their estimated useful life. Approximately 20,000 plus feet of pipe have currently exceeded their estimated useful lives. Per the criteria in section 7.9, approximately 5,553 feet of pipe will exceed their useful lives within the next 10 years. The locations of these pipes have already exceeded their useful lives or will exceed their useful lives in the next 10 years are shown in one of the attached figures. The cost of replacing that, and they give a cost. So, and then this is just, again, just an overall view of our piping system. Again, the main thing is our consultant looked at our water system and identified what we had and what our weak links are. You know, we've got our main line that runs up Ventura Road, was constructed in the 40s. It's that green ductile iron pipe that is 70 plus years old. And you know, that needs to be replaced. It's at the end of its useful lifespan. One thing I just recently did is we had a request for encroachment permits to cross Ventura Road in accordance with the municipal code because of safety and access issues to the base. I denied those encroachment permits to bore underneath Ventura Road because we have the water lines there, we have other utilities there, and very concerned about damaging or breaking one of that 70-plus-year-old pipe. And plus, the Water Master Plan calls for replacement of some of those pipes, and I did not want to add another utility that we would have to work around when that pipe eventually gets replaced. So after my review of the Water Master Plan, the Water Atlas, we have some issues that have to be addressed. We need to have a capital improvement program. It's going to take at least a year to design a replacement for one of the main lines. So that certainly has to be considered when establishing the base rate for our water customers. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Is there any questions?
Actually, I think we got through 2 of the 4 items, so anything relevant to the master plan and the earlier discussion is fair game. So do I have a question here?
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On page 1.6, the 2 standby wells,
Yes.
are they, I'm assuming that you activate those temporarily, occasionally, and maintain and so on, correct?
I'm not sure on that. That's a question for really operations.
The
And
famous Mr.
Hickox
Hickok,
could-
yeah?
Yes, thank you. Yes, those 2 wells are standby wells on record with the state. They are operated and maintained for rotation. We do sample to meet the minimum sampling requirements to maintain the standby status with the state. That means that if at any time there was, let's say, a natural disaster or catastrophe that we were isolated from a water supply, if power was available as a result of whatever caused the outage, those wells could be used in an emergency state with limited use for firefighting and hygiene and public health.
Okay.
Boil water orders would probably be issued during the use of those wells if it went to that operation.
How potable is that, those 2 wells?
Well, it's groundwater untreated. The annual samples that we take for bacteriologicals come back negative, but because there is no disinfection treatment there, these wells would not receive treatment for consumption. So because of that reason, again, the use of those wells would be for firefighting and public health, flushing toilets and showers and whatnot.
Okay.
Not so much for consumption and cooking and
So we have a generator in case of emergency power outage, number 1.
hopefully.
Number 2, do they go to our water facilities, or they to go to a separate channel?
They go directly into the distribution system.
Okay, very good.
They do not reach the PHWA treatment plant.
One more question, if I can, it's probably you, Mr. Hickox, is item 9.5, the asbestos cement pipe.
Yes.
Is there any possibilities of that is leaking contamination into our water? Is the asbestos pretty much contained?
The asbestos is fine as long as a couple conditions are met. One is that it's undisturbed, so it's in the ground, not really being tampered with. It's kept wet due to the product inside the pipe. The outside really isn't an issue unless you're sawing or cutting into the pipe. Then there's a potential for contamination. But there's processes that we have to follow in order to work with that type of pipe.
Okay,
to
so we don't have to
ensure
worry
that-
about drinking asbestos.
Correct.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Mr. Villafana, these projects, are they listed by order of their priorities? Which ones you feel need to be done first, second, third?
Yes, the priority was set by the consultant back in 2011, but I've reviewed them and I've reviewed the water master plan, and, I agree with the way they did it. So yes, they're laid out in priority.
Anything else? Any questions? Yes, I have a couple. When we say useful life, how does that compare to the actual condition of the lines? And I'm going to give you an example of some of the scare that I think folks have about bridges being substandard is a bit of an exaggeration. It's simply because engineering standards change over time doesn't mean that the bridges themselves are unsafe. So my question to you is do we know what the real condition of those lines are relative to the estimated useful life, where that number came from?
On that, we have, let me set a little of the in-ground conditions. City of Port Hueneme, we have groundwater here at approximately 9 feet. In some areas, we actually have it at 5 feet. So, and then I do not know what the corrosive properties are of the soil. Today, when you do a project, you're required by the building code to test the corrosiveness of the soil. So I don't know what that is, and it was not done back in 1940. So I know in the general Oxnard area, there are some areas that have the soil has more corrosive properties. You add that with a brackish water, because that's what the water table is at that level, would be brackish, which would be more likely to corrode a ductile iron pipe, as that 114-inch line is. I believe there is some in the past, and I would have to check with Mr. Hickox, I believe some of the lines have been TV'd, but I don't know how recently. That would be the best way to check the usefulness of those, their current condition. But no, 70 years in a 70-plus years in a somewhat hostile environment, high groundwater, potentially corrosive soil, I think a little over 70 years is not is about what you're going to look at. Also, if you watch the news, there are numerous breaks in the city of Los Angeles, and their pipes are, 70. A lot of those pipes that are breaking are 70 years old. So, I think I don't think it's arbitrary. I do think. And
Well, I didn't say arbitrary.
But 70 years is.
No, what I'm after here is reconciling someone's concept of a threshold, 70 years, versus what the true conditions are. So is it really necessary to replace that infrastructure if in fact it's still functional?
I think Mr. Hickox has some of the answers, so I'll let him on the condition of the pipe.
Correct. One of the industry standards that we use to identify problem areas or useful life of the pipe is the history of, let's just say, the history of the water main running down First Street. If that pipe is 70 years old and it has had a documented history of repairs, there's an indicator right there. If the pressure in the system has to be reduced in order to prevent water main breaks, that's an indicator right there. Our pressure, we tested it during the 2011 AKM Water Master Plan, and per the consultant's direction, the only way to know the condition of your system is to do a stress test, kind of like you going to the doctor when you got chest pains. One of the first things they're going to do is put a monitor on you and tell you to do some exercises, and they'll see what happens. It's not to put you into cardiac arrest, but it has to do with seeing how well your system can withstand that additional pressure. Water mains are similar. We tried to raise the pressure 9 pounds in our system, and it subsequently cost about $600,000 in repairs. So, but that's when the consultant knew just how bad the system was overall. They found out where the stress point was. So 9 PSI was the max. We lowered it down 5 PSI for operational needs because pressures change depending on demand in the system. So we lowered the system pressure down to 55 pounds. And then with an additional safeguard, we lowered it down to 50 in our control setting. That puts about a 45 PSI operational system in service. So 40 is really the bottom line in order to be able to meet all the requirements that the state has. The state calls for 20 PSI at every service connection within the city. It doesn't require 20 PSI at the top of a 20-story building. It only requires 20 PSI down at the service connection or the meter. When operations are impacted, such as a fire hydrant knockdown or fire hydrant use, the system in pressure will drop 20 to 25 pounds, which means if there's a fire, there's going to be people in our system that are going to be right at state minimum, which then could produce back siphonage from the water system, from undesirable water entering the system from fire lines, the double check valves that aren't functioning properly, irrigation systems, elevated storage such as Anacapa View condos, that's elevated. So if the pressure did drop at that service connection, anything up on that hill has the potential to come back down and enter into the public water system. Hopefully the backflow devices, which are required to be tested every year, prevent that condition from happening. So there are some indicators out there that are existing in our system that does show that the system is struggling. There's
Yeah,
some
see, that kind
repairs
of gets
that
me
need
back
be-
to my point about concept of substandard. Maybe there's an ideal that we should be aspiring to, but whether or not we can live with a lesser quality or pressure level. And so let's take these questions and, let's separate them. You mentioned line failure may in fact be an indicator that indeed the useful life has been achieved or reached. Do we have what kind of records do we have of that kind of failure?
We don't have a whole lot of records. Back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, there wasn't a whole lot of data. I have not personally seen any records of the failures, but nowadays, the most current modern time, we do have work order systems that we generate work orders to go out and fix repairs. We could pull up a report probably in the last 10 years. We can pull up reports on water main breaks that have occurred. However, in the last 10 years is when we've lowered the pressure in the system just to prevent the blowouts. So we're going to have a lot less number now compared to what we would have had 20 years ago or longer. But if we were to raise the pressure and allow for proper firefighting capability on the north end, then those blowouts would occur and we would be able to track those. But it's going to come at a cost.
So we've actually been operating in this condition for the last 10 years, is that correct? Where there's been insufficient fire flow? What kind of incidents have occurred that have put people at risk? Has anyone lost a structure, or has there been loss of life? Again, I'm trying to get to the urgency here, because part of the formula is how far out you spread your capital planning. You indicate a useful life, and you look in the 10 so projects I see there, a good number of them, their useful life is really 2035. And yet the rate structure that was set up in place about, 9 years ago, actually had a compressed 5-year time frame for funding these improvements. And that's way in advance of the useful life of the projects that I see in this list. So excuse me for drilling down on these questions, but that's a big part of what drives our water rates is cost recovery, or anticipating, pre-funding the expenses of having to replace our system. So at this point, I'd still like to understand what the condition of our system is relative to what the useful life is to determine urgency of replacement. That will then influence the timeline for how quickly we need to accumulate funds to make those repairs or improvements. The next question has to do with what is our lawful responsibility? We keep talking about fire flow, and we've been undersized, if I understand this correctly, for the last 10 years. Can somebody sue the city right now if they had a fire in their garage? And because we've been in this mode for 10 years, is that correct?
We are not currently meeting the fire flow demands. We contract with Ventura County Fire Protection District, and I've met with the Fire Protection District in the last several weeks to discuss this issue. And fortunately, and by the grace of God, we've had no serious fires or no loss of life. However, the city has been put on constructive notice that we have a deficiency.
Who's that? I'm sorry.
What?
Has somebody put the city on notice?
Well, it's been the city, the past public works directors and the city contracted with a consultant to analyze our water system, and they found deficiencies. we don't meet the fire flow requirements for the Ventura County Fire Protection District. If there was a serious fire and there was loss of life, yes, there is a potential because the city was aware that there were deficiencies and didn't have and was not proactive. So there is a potential. But having a water master plan that identifies these deficiencies and lays out a capital improvement program to address these would mitigate any potential liability because the city recognized the deficiencies, had a systematic plan to address these, stretched over whatever period of time, but they acknowledged them and addressed them. And further, I'm not, we also fall under the Public Utilities Commission, and there are some provisions in there, and I believe the city attorney may have some more information on that, that talks about mandates on our fire flow.
Yeah, we just had a moment to talk about that issue a little earlier, and I seem to recall on several years ago, though, researching an issue and determining that there is a state mandate, I believe, a state mandate to maintain fire, I'm not sure what the terminology is, but appropriate water pressure and availability for fire under the Public Utilities Code. But I haven't looked at it in quite some time, and I think that's something we should look at to see if there's any kind of state mandate in that. So I can help you look into that if you want.
If you're going to do that, I kind of look at this as building codes. All of our codes seem to morph over time. And today's standards will be different 10 years from now. And so what I see is a system that was built to whatever the standards were at the time, and they've changed. So when we say today's requirement, we have a system that's non-conforming. It's, I wouldn't call it substandard, it's simply non-conforming. But that's true with virtually of all of our buildings in Port Hueneme, that codes have changed over time. So if they were to be rebuilt, they'd have to be rebuilt to certain seismic requirements and on and on and on. So I'm just trying to understand what is our obligation. And,
well,
if it could come down to, well, okay, we're non-conforming,
sure.
But does that make us liable?
The difference between the houses is that we don't own the houses. We're just applying the standards in place at the time. People build the houses, they're in compliance with the law. If they come to remodel it at a later time, then they have to comply with the current standards. However, as a public entity, we own utilities, which people are forced to use, and we have an obligation under various kinds of mandates or rules or regulations to provide those in an appropriate way. And what I'm hearing from the Public Works Director is that we are not producing water flow, at least a part of the city, which is up to the minimum standards for effective fire protection. Regardless of what the standard was when that was put in, it doesn't matter because it's an ongoing operating system that we have as the city government, not some private person living in a house. So as things change, we have an obligation to maintain the safety of the people regardless of whether the standards changed or not. Now, whether or not this, I would say that one of the things I kind of disagree with that Mr. Villafana said was that if we have the plan that would mitigate, it might or it might not. It depends on how the court looks at it. If they feel like, well, you had 10 years, you've known this, and you didn't do anything, then we don't think that adopting this plan late mitigates that. It's a factual question that comes before the court, and if in fact somebody lost a home or a life or a child or whatever, and they're claiming that the city's liable, then the court's going to look at, did you maintain an appropriate system? And if not, then, you know, unless there's a damn good reason, you're going to be liable. It's the same thing that you see all the time in these lawsuits because the state didn't grade a curve to the right elevation for safety at the speed limit which they're allowing on it and things like that. So if you create the situation and people rely on it and it's not adequate, then there's potential liability. Whether or not And to what degree that liability would be, of course, is a fact-based issue. But I think it's safe to say that if, in fact, we are not meeting, according to our own, in essence, fire department, we're not meeting the fire pressures, then I would agree that we are in constructive notice that we have an inadequate system, and if there is a disaster of any kind, then we have a problem.
Well, you're the attorney, but I would hesitate to say that it's an inadequate system. It may be non-conforming to the current standards of the day, but let's move on. There's a system in place right now, if I understand this, that we are able to tie into Oxnard to provide for that contingency of a fire flow need. Is that my understanding? Is that correct?
Yes, there are a couple of locations that would allow for a connection. They are not currently in place. It would require construction.
Okay, well, is that an alternative that's worth exploring versus the, whatever, $18 million, whatever the cost is to provide for the same water pressure?
Increasing the water pressure through an interconnection doesn't do anything more than our ability to increase the pressure at our own connection. It's the system's pipe internally within the distribution system that cannot support additional pressure. So that's why I believe that the consultant put a sentence in there that the emergency connections identified with the city of Oxnard should only be deemed as a temporary source of water for meeting fire flow capabilities and not a permanent connection.
So at this point we have, well, I'm not suggesting a permanent connection only to be used in the case of an emergency. Exactly what I think the system is set up to do. So how many incidents have we had in the last 10 years that required a fire flow that didn't require the connection, this redundant connection with the city of Oxnard? So again, I'm getting down to how critical is it that we make these improvements at a great expense if we have alternatives available to us? And up to this point, it hasn't been a problem. So I'd like a little bit more information about what would go into that kind of connection. And the engineer, the consultant that prepared the report, seems to suggest that that would be an acceptable way of dealing with a fire flow need on an intermittent basis.
Only for an emergency condition, but that would not solve the other issues because you know, we still have pipe in the ground that is 70+ years old that feeds the north side.
I understand. There's two separate issues.
Right.
One is pressure, undersized lines, and the other is simply the age and the condition of the infrastructure.
Professionally, you know, that was done in 2011. Right now, if those pipes were, say, installed in 1945, they're 70+ years old. I don't know when exactly. They just say 1940, so I split the difference and said 45. They're 70+ years old. Any replacement plan takes several years to design and years to implement. So now those lines are pushing 80 years old. I firmly believe you're starting to live on borrowed time with those. And that's the main water line up to the north end. So,
okay. Is there any, and maybe look to my colleagues here, I think that Mayor Pro Tem Schnapp was involved in the water rate setting. Is it, why did we compress our capital improvement program into a 5-year time frame when in fact there's a lot of these projects that their useful life goes out to 2035? Is there any history on that as to why we compressed our capital improvement planning?
I would have to look into the water master plan to look at that specific part of the report. But I believe that 5-year was the phase 1, which was the main line going up Ventura Road and down Channel Islands. It wasn't, if I remember correctly, it wasn't the whole plan, the whole 31 million. It was just that phase 1 to get that water to the north end. And then the rest of the projects could be phased in over time. And I believe that there was a statement in there that it wouldn't be unrealistic to have this plan completed in 15 years. I think there was a statement in there, but I'd have to go back and revisit that.
Well, it may be feasible to do in 15 years, but if the actual life expectancy of some of these improvements could be pushed out yet another 15 years, that reduces the ratepayers' expenses to have to pre-fund those improvements. That's all. That's where I'm going.
So if I can
Sure.
add to that. So Mr. Hickox is correct that originally we didn't look at a $30 million price tag. In actuality, we did the water rate study prior to then doing a very extensive study when City Manager Dave Norman was here in 2011. And we found, you know, all these issues that are in this report. When we originally took a look at the water rate study, it was because we in fact did not have any set aside to do any repairs, to do any, you know, really extensive maintenance and or changing things out. Replacement, thank you, the other R word. Yes, and so we ended up then realizing that there was a catch-up because there was nothing in place. We knew that our infrastructure was aging. We didn't necessarily know all these other things that came out then in the 2011 study, so we were just trying to get at least ahead and start saving up money because at that point we had nothing.
And
so
excuse me,
that's where it was.
If
You know,
I
that's-
may,
No, I understand that. It's just that the compressed nature of the time frame versus what we see here in the schedule of useful life.
Yeah, so it was to take care of some of the issues, but not all of them, and anyways.
Thanks.
Our consultant has some input on this.
and if I may real quick add to what you were saying, you're absolutely right. When the rate study in 2009 was done and approved, it was with a knowledge that a water master plan would be completed and it would have identified deficiencies in our system. And because we had no CIP reserved for replacements of pipe, the rate study back then did account for, I believe it was $1 million a year, which still wasn't enough to fund the replacement projects, but it was a start of a CIP reserve program, which then as we move forward after the meters were in place and rates kind of settled in, then we could revisit the CIP programs. So that's where the money that's in the reserve program now came from. And it was done so without knowledge of the water master plan. When the water master plan was completed, that's what confirmed the suspicion of the conditions of the system based on experience of staff.
So we were actually at that point, as a group, looking at that $500,000 to $1 million range, and we started to realize that we could blow right through $500,000 every year easily without having to replace anything but just, you know, repair and maintain.
Correct.
And so we didn't feel comfortable that would be that would be the ceiling. We realized that that's probably the floor, and so we created something, you know, a little more than that. Yeah.
Correct.
Yes, I'd like
Please,
to address
sure.
a question from you, Mr. Mayor. I believe what you're talking about is this concept of intergenerational equity, where you're putting assets.
That's a big word.
But I like it.
Yeah, and so essentially what it means is you're putting assets in the ground that are going to last 30, 40, 50 years, right? But you're asking your current ratepayers to pay for it. So that's why sometimes certain agencies choose to take on debt if they're okay with it, because debt spreads that debt service payment over 30 years, which is more tied to the useful life of the asset. But if you don't take on debt, then unfortunately, yes, you are asking your current ratepayers to pay for system assets that will last 30, 40, 50 years. But to mitigate that, you should have a capacity fee or a connection fee. You probably don't have a lot of growth in this city, but for whatever amount of growth you do have, whenever a new person connects, they're paying a capacity to help refund the people who invested in the system.
Yeah, we don't have that luxury, unfortunately.
Yeah, but
I understand what your
okay.
thought is.
Do you find that to be with some of the larger, or some of the other cities that might be just in the development part, or that have lots of development that they're looking at?
Capacity fees? Yes. Cities that grow have a capacity fee, and then when a new person connects to the system, they're essentially reimbursing old customers for the fact that they've built and they've maintained a system that's ready to be used for a new customer. But you don't have that luxury here because you're pretty much built out. So it just comes back to the concept of whether or not you want to take on debt to spread those costs over the useful life of an asset.
And if I may, just because we're talking about that connection fee, Callegas does charge the city for new customers based on meter size for a connection fee to the State Water Project. So that is doing exactly what Mr. Gagnon was just explaining. So unfortunately, that connection fee is bypassing the city of Port Hueneme and is going up to Callegas. So there are some connection fees, but it doesn't benefit our banking.
They're paying for the system that they put in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Questions,
had just a little bit of clarification for the newcomer around here. We're saying that we did not have a CIP before 2009 for our water?
There was no program in the financial database for CIP. We did have discussions of CIP projects, and we did put other CIP projects such as road rehabilitation, sidewalk rehabilitation, stuff like that. But as far as the water system, no, sir.
And so we began rapidly putting that together in '09.
Well,
How
we
much we
started.
got in there now?
I'm sorry?
How much money do we have in that CIP account?
I'm going to guess somewhere around 10 million.
10 million. And if we were to build out all 8 of these projects in sequential order and financing it as best we can, I'm thinking, how long is it going to take us to do that?
Well, if you're looking at about a year to design some of these projects, because we'd have to do.
Right.
a
If
route
we
of-
were going to write the check today, when would we see any?
Well, you're, for phase one, and we would phase all these, you're looking at the first phase, about a year to design, and then probably another 6 months to a year to construct, because we'd have to stage it, because it's going into, along a street, and so, yeah, so I would think the whole thing would be, 10 years probably.
That's what I'm thinking too, upwards of 10 years.
Eight to 10 is what I was thinking. If you were able to write the check today and turn us loose,
Right.
it would be 8 to 10 years.
Right, but we're going to have to get some fancy financing going with this as well, I think. So it may take us a little bit longer. And the mayor's suggestion that some of these priorities that might not be as old, or we think they might last some time, that's, as you say, we're living on borrowed time. That's a gamble. But those are the ones that have to fall further back in our priorities. But we're going to have to get busy laying some pipe.
The phase one of the water master plan is the main line going up Ventura and down Channel Islands. If I remember correctly, that was 16 million for design and construction of that phase alone. So that's about half of the project. We currently have around 10, so and that was 16 million was 2011 dollars. So that would probably easily be a little over 20 million today.
From the numbers here, I'm estimating almost $31 million.
That was for the whole project in
That's what I'm thinking.
2011.
Yeah,
Yeah, in
2011 dollars.
In 2011 dollars.
Right.
So in today's dollars, probably another 10 million, roughly.
Sure.
If I can add a little bit more history to all of this, it was when Doug Brees and I came onto the council, and the city had just taken a look at a water meter, or it had a water meter committee, because at that time it was all you can eat, one price for anybody, right? For all water that was being used by residential customers. And so at that time then there was something that came down from the state that said you actually have to start figuring out how much water everybody's using. And so that water meter committee transitioned and morphed into a water rate study committee. And so we had community members as well as Doug and I served on this committee. So, you know, there was a whole blend of things that were going on with the state and with the city and all that we realized, okay, everybody now has a meter. How do we apply somebody's usage to then what the cost of the water is, what it costs us to provide that water, and what people could pay? And so, you know, it was a long drawn out process, but it was completed within, I believe, a year's time to factor in so many more things, including, you know, this improvement plan for us, and how do we regulate, or how do we charge for the water people use, and, you know, setting up then a tiered system and setting a base plus the variable.
Correct.
So.
And all of those reports that they said that we would be reporting in the future, we are reporting today.
Yeah, see,
It's
so.
a monthly basis based on customer classification. They want to know indoor use, outdoor use. They want to know if it's residential, commercial, institutional. There's documents now in my database that will break this all down, just for the purposes of reporting, because the state uses that information to see if we're in compliance with demand reduction programs.
Councilman Hershey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Hickox, a real quick question, if I may. What is our electrolysis and ground electrolysis here, and is it deteriorating our metal pipes? Do we have an indicator?
Other than the pipe failing itself, we have not gone out. We do not have an active leak detection program that can go out and measure the electrical charge of the soil, but it's definitely there. Ground does carry electrical current. Water is a conductor. It helps move that energy. So there is electrolysis occurring below ground, and it will attack all bare metal.
We have no idea how much it's causing.
Not to a measurable amount. Our system does still have some old lead and oakum joints that are still in the system. We don't know how many there are below ground. Those are 70, 80-year-old technology. Some of that material is what we want to target once we get into expanding the program and getting into the smaller pipe diameters where the older pipe is. So you're right, the electrolysis is a concern. The longer it's in the ground, the more potential we have for degradation.
Thank you, sir.
At this point, we're kind of in the midway point in the presentation, and I would invite our two audience members, if you would like to come forward, make comments, ask questions, this would, I think, would be a good time for that.
City Council, this is the first time I've done this, and this was very impromptu for me. My name is Ricardo, and I've been in Port Hueneme for the past 2 years. I lived here before, and I moved away, and I moved back to the city. I understand a little bit about what's going on. I know about cost. I run a business, so I understand. However, the water rates, they're crazy. It's expensive. I talk to neighbors every day who are struggling to make those ends meet. There are programs from the state that, from Edison, that help, with this, with lower cost, and it's still not effective. I spoke to 10 neighbors over the past week, and every one of them has been having issues with making ends meet. These are 10 neighbors, 10 working families. And one neighbor brought it up. He's like, well, how come I pay the same rate as a house on the other side of town? $150 as a minimum every two months. And I was like, that's a great question, and I encourage people to come here. However, it is a good point. A home is paying $150 as a minimum. I live in an apartment, and I'm paying a minimum of $150. I was gone for 6 months, and I racked up a bill of $450. And it's something that was concerning to me, and that's why I wrote an email, because I do believe in voicing my opinion. I understand the construction. However, take that into consideration. There are these families who, they can barely make it. Even myself, and I'm a father, I'm a single dad, I manage a business, and I can barely make ends meet. And water is the most important thing. And, I can't believe when I look at my statement and I'm like, wow, I'm struggling with water, And, that's what I wanted to talk about.
My suggestion is you might want to stick around, because this is really just the beginning of what goes into rate setting. We're just now talking about capital replacement, which is a big ticket item, but there are other facets to setting rates, and that's going to be, I think, the later presentations here. So if you might want to stay around, and if there's any questions that come to mind, you could still come back and address us.
Thank you. I will.
Do I have another taker?
Council, my name is Eileen Trace. I live at Hueneme Bay, the north end of town. Bring that to your attention. And so I sent an email to a few of you last week because I have some deep concerns about what are we going to do in 4 years when we probably won't have a place for our treatment plant, et cetera. But now that I came to this meeting, I see why the urgency is far more current than 4 years from now. So I agree with him. I can't see the justification for the huge water rates that we're paying here. And now that I find out that we're not even really investing in capital improvement, I can't imagine why no one looked at that in the past. But I'm awfully glad you're bringing it up now. And so I have a lot more to worry about, because I've got my house with the fire problem could be one that burns down. So I hope that even if you have to increase rates to provide us safety in our homes and continue to look at the huge water rates and the justification for it, I'd be very grateful. And I hope some of you will be worried about when Oxnard kicks our treatment plan out in 4 years. Do we have Plan B? Because I don't ever hear a bunch of discussion down here. I feel like I'm the only one that worries. And I always feel comforted, like Councilmember Burke, thank you for your questions today. I feel like there's a kindred spirit here along with the mayor. So I hope all of you will please get a sense of urgency about addressing these problems and have ongoing discussions and suggestions for solutions. Thank you.
Well, just to give you a sense that we are moving in that direction, this is an immediate issue, and actually it's been percolating for a while, but we have authorized to doing a strategic planning process to deal with the very longer range, you call it maybe near term, but not the immediate level that we're at, which is simply shoring up our rates. But we have authorized moving forward on a strategic planning process. It would include our partners that are part of the Port Hueneme Water Authority. So you're right on. It's a two-part process, and I'm not sure if we have a schedule yet laid out. Mr. Butler, is there any ideas that you have in that regard? Is there a timeline yet been set for that?
Yeah, there will be. This will be public workshops, strategic planning workshops that I believe we're targeting now for January, right after New Year, would be the first session.
First public session, correct.
So I'll be there. And I think the other problem that deeply concerns me is the state of United Water's quality. And I don't hear discussions on what are our options. I tried to pose a few of the options in my email, but like the gentleman that spoke before me, I'm kind of new to Hueneme, so, I'm learning, trying to feel like I'm running fast to learn down here. But if we have more open discussions, or even if you have discussions that are not broadcast at city council meetings, I sure would be glad to be present and hear about ideas for solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen, because you bring up some really key points. I know many of those items actually are taken care of through the Port Hueneme Water Agency. And so I know you attend some of those meetings as well. So that's where most of them are going to be answered and directed and discussed. And then the city will get a report from the water agency. But it's really those larger issues are part of that agency.
Well, council member, I do either listen from home, extreme, because sometimes my health is a problem. And I listen to the water agency one way or the other. And the members of that panel, there's a couple, one of them here, that, it seems concerned. But most of them don't even seem to be aware of the problems, much less discuss them. So, I don't know. Somebody's got to wake those people up down there. I would appreciate. I don't know who's in charge of that, but somebody's got to get some sense of responsibility at that water agency, because it's not just wandering down here twice a month and trying to remember to keep your mic on when you talk. It's a lot more than that, as you all know. And anyways, thank you I feel a little better when I can make everybody else worry, so I'm not the only one.
Very well. All right, I think at that point, unless there's any other questions council has, we could move on to the next part of the agenda.
Right. Anyone else have any other questions about either, the water? Basically, this was to give everyone a little background on the water system and talk a little bit about the water master plan. And as I said, it's very voluminous, and I do have those available. I can have CDs delivered to your boxes if you'd like a complete CD, or I can email you in sections, PDFs of the various sections. So if just let me know, and I can have that done. Mr. Hensley?
One quick question, if I may, Mr. Mayor. I understand we have $10 million in reserve fund committed to these projects. Is that correct?
Approximately $10 million, yes. That's
so
correct.
We could start using those, setting up a plan and moving forth some of the most urgent pipe replacements, right? Designing and implementation of a program.
That is correct. This year, tentatively, we were scheduled to start design on phase 1. And we were going to do, the initial part of that would be an alignment study, because we have so many things on Ventura Road, and we leave the main, the existing system stays in place while we put in this new line. So, but yes, that was our plan, was to go forward, and I believe it was in the budget for design of phase 1.
I do have a question, and so we're dealing with this comprehensive look with our water system. Have we, and we know that we're below, in terms of what the fire district requires for pressure. Have we heard anything from the naval base with regards to anything that might be deficient there? I mean, have we, because we supply water to them, right? But are there any like either underlying or overarching things that we need to be concerned of with our partners there on the base?
You bring up a good point, but it's a double-sided or has two legs to it. Mm-hmm. The first leg is that the member agencies of Port Hueneme Water Agency do not have a problem with volume or pressure supplied to their representative agency. The PHWA pipeline is relatively new. It's 20 years old. It's intact. It operates at 90 to 93 pounds of pressure every day, 24 hours a day. And that's more than enough to supply volume and pressure to each member agency of PHWA. And then how multiple systems work is if one agency, PHWA, is supplying the pressure, then the first agency online will drop 8 to 10 pounds of pressure so that their control valves will operate with a differential between the PHWA pressure and that system's pressure. And that pressure delta is required in order for the control valves to work. So then further on down the line, we still got 90 pounds PSI for PHWA, but the next customer will do the same thing. They will drop pressure to their system. Now, Channel Islands, I don't have information on Channel Islands as far as what kind of breakage or problem they have, but I know that their control system is set at 78 pounds inlet pressure to their system. And if they regulate it down further, I don't have that information. The Navy base knocks it down to 60 pounds of pressure going into their system. That is because they too have older infrastructure on bases, probably put back in the 30s and 40s. And they have some problems with other things such as low flow, velocity, not low flow and capacity, but the water just moves really slow because in parts, the back half of the base, there's only, empty warehouses with a single bathroom and not a lot of residential use. So they got oversized pipe and low flow through the pipes, and they have different problems, operating problems, but not associated with the inlet pressure that's supplied to them.
Okay.
So, I know it's a long-winded question, but it clearly states the difference between the different systems.
Okay, thanks.
All right, shall we move on?
Thank you.
Please.
And for the second part of the presentation, there were a series of questions that were put out by the council, and Mr. Hickox has done a very good job about trying to answer these point for point. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to answer those, and he's prepared a presentation. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Villafana. Mayor, members of council. I put this packet together based on the questions submitted by Mr. Figg as a result of a review of the rate model study that was done in coordination with the consultant. We did that review on August 29th, and these questions came out of a series of activity. One was the rate model study that we reviewed in the council chambers, conference room, and then the rate model study that was presented to council. These questions came out of those two activities, is my understanding. Unfortunately, I went through and made all of the comments to every single inquiry within this document. The document is 72 pages on its own with all of the attachments. My responses include another 72 pages. So right here, this document is double-sided, so it would represent 144 pages. In the interest of time for today, I just briefly spoke with the consultant. In order for him to move forward with information that he needs to take home today, we need to get to a certain point in this discussion, and he needs about an hour of your attention to really focus on the questions that he needs answers to that can go into the rate model study. Hopefully we can get to that point if possible. So what I would like to do is the packets that you were originally submitted, the blue bound packet, that only had the 72-page presentation that I'm presenting without the comments printed on them. There was an issue with getting the comments printed onto the hard copies and then printed without being overlaid on top of them. In fact, your version of the hard copy doesn't even have the comment buttons attached to that copy that you have in the binder. It's strictly the 72-page document that the mayor submitted. However, in that box up there and available for each member of council is the double-sided 144-page document that clearly provides the information that was requested. So in the interest of getting to the point where we can move forward, I would like to forego the 144 pages and allow questions. I know Mr. Figg has information that is specifically relevant that he wants answers to. If we could possibly narrow down to a few points, I'd be more than happy to drill into those. I have the 6 attachments that are in the blue bound document that I would like to target for clarity. I think what would help us move this forward today to give Mr. Gagnon the information he's looking for is to touch on these 6 numbers 1 through 6 in your binder. These 6 items I think will help clarify some of the cloudiness of some of the questions that were in the document, and maybe just touching these 6 items will provide enough light to answer or clarify some of the direction that we're looking for. And then if there's specific questions regarded to the 72-page document, I'd be more than happy to go into that specific response if that's okay with the council.
Proceed.
Okay. Item number 1 in the...
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Hensley.
If the council will excuse me, I wasn't aware of this coming up when I made another commitment. I have a committee that I have to get to, and it's kind of imperative that I get there, so I'm going to have to bow out. But thank you very much. I appreciate it. Maybe we can get together over coffee and you can highlight it for me. Okay?
Certainly, if there's any information in there that you wish to address, let me know and I'll be able to help.
Great. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Okay, attachment number 1 basically brings up 3 different rate study comparisons. The first comparison is a comparison to neighboring agencies that was completed by the city of Oxnard. In this particular comparison, they used a average use of 9 HCF for their comparison. I'm assuming, without knowing or confirming with the city of Oxnard, that 9 HCF was based on historical data from their system, and that they know that their average single family use value is 9 HCF. The next page, the 2016 water rate comparison, I actually generated this report, and this report was done just quickly based on a 15 HCF value. And that 15 HCF value was selected because if you look at deeper into the rate comparisons of the different cities and water suppliers, you'll see that not everybody employs the same type of rate structure. Some have tiers, some do not. Some have more fixed rate assigned to their cost, and some have more to the variable rate. So it's really not an apples to apples. So because of the different components that each system employs. But what is an apple to apple is the 15. The 15 is used across all the agencies listed, and then that cost for the 15 is then tabulated out. The third comparison sheet is the Ventura County 2011-2012 grand jury inquiry to rates. And in this case, we also used 15 HCF. And I guess what I'm trying to respond here is that it really doesn't matter if we use 6 as a number, 12 as a number, or 15 as a number, or 50. As long as we're using the same number across each agency, along with their approved and adopted rate structure, then the results at the end will show the same thing. It'll just be a different number, but it'll be the same thing. So using a different value from one comparison to another comparison really shouldn't be a concern, but what should be a concern is that that value is utilized across the board for each of the agencies that you're using in the comparison. And so one of the questions within the response or inquiry from Mr. Figg was why we use different comparison numbers, the HCF values. Item number 2, attachment number 2, I'm sorry, is the Prop 218 process.
Would it be appropriate to us ask questions as we go, or would you prefer that we wait?
Sure, we can go one at a time if you'd like.
Okay, first of all, I don't necessarily agree with your assessment that selecting a variable, the amount of water, in doing analysis isn't relevant. It's very relevant when folks are saying that they're paying excessive rates, and yet we're using fairly low water consumption factors. So I think it has real-time value, and it's confusing because right now we're suggesting that our water consumption at the variable figure of 3.8 is now almost the same price that people were paying back in 2008. And I just, it's hard for me to reconcile that the rates today are the same as they were back in, or the actual cost to the consumer is the same today. What they're being billed for is the same as it was when the initial rates went into effect in 2008, 2009. So that was the purpose of that whole set of questions is that really true? Is that we were, in our Prop 218 assessment, we were using 12 units of water, and now you're saying it's down to 6 units. And yet, some of the examples I gave you, the billings, don't seem to square up, or the state figures. So explain to me how that could be. Is it really, am I misreading this information, that our rates are virtually the same as they were back in 2008, 2009?
I'd like to break, you brought up a number of points, and I'd like to break that down, if I may. First of all, the comparison of the 3 different rate comparisons used and the different values used. I've received information from the consultant that they're stating that it doesn't really matter the number that you use, 6, 12, 8, 4. It's going to, as long as you use that number equally across the agencies in your comparison, you'll end up with the same outcome.
I understand, but it's a matter of disclosure to the public of what they're actually paying.
Right.
And again, if you would please just address that concern I have, is that we're suggesting that people are using half again as much water today as it was forecast back in 2008 and 2009. Is that correct?
That is correct. In 2008 is the data that was used for the Prop 218 process for 2009. In 2008, because you have to have data to plug into a rate structure, and so the consultant back at that time was Barrow Wells, and they used data from 2008 records that showed how much water was sold to the customers and how much was sold to residential. And that was based on a calculation. And the reason why it had to be based on a calculation in 2008 is because water meters were not throughout the city. Not every house in the city had a meter. Even though every residence had water supply, there was no meter to account for their usage. So based on a calculation in 2008, that's how the 12 units HCF came to be for an average single-family resident. Now, today, 2017, we know that data is our guidance. We have historical meter data that shows the breakdown of the single-family resident classification that we spoke of earlier, that we are reporting every month to the state, which you also just referenced in another report that we're
Which indicated a higher consumption.
We're gonna go there. But this 12 units was before the meters went in place. Once we put the meters in place, our system demand dropped 32%. Once the rate structure was implemented and started to change the fixed and variable rate across a 5-year period, that will impact the cost to the customer. So, and also today, the drought is here. So there's mandatory demand reductions placed on us by the state. There's meters that have been installed now since the 2009 Prop 218 process. And consumption overall is being driven by the rates that the customers are paying. So today's value of 6 HCF is real. It's
And
based
if
on
I
data.
might, is that the base that you would use? Whatever rate variables are decided upon by the council, you're going to start out with a new base period, which is the 6 HCF, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. And that was updated from the 5 HCF that we saw in the previous presentation. The consultant was talking and I were talking. He said I could have rounded up or could have rounded down. It was right in that area, and he chose to round down. And then I looked at data, and I agreed that it should be rounded up. So 6 is it's a more appropriate number to use than 5.
Okay.
So as we move forward, the 6 HCF will be the single-family average for this city. Moving over to attachment 3, which is the state Department of Water Resources report. This is where every month, as an urban water supplier, I'm required to report to the state the water demand for residential use. Now that we have meters with residential classifications, we have single-family resident, we have multifamily resident, we have commercial, we have industrial, we have institutional, we have irrigation. So we have a whole slew of reporting requirements that we have to submit now. This document here on attachment 3, this is what the state uses to see if every water system in the state is in compliance with residential gallons per capita day values. This does not get included into single-family resident water rates. This is what every person in the city, we have a population of 22,500 on record with the state. It will vary a little bit up and down from year to year, but our reporting population is 22,500. And every month, I know how much water we purchase and deliver, and I have to then break that down by percentage, how much went to residential single family, how much went to residential multifamily, how much went to institutional and commercial, and report that to the state. And that's what this number produces. This number produces a residential gallons per capita day value, which means in the bottom of the page, 2015, our average residential per capita day was 55 gallons. The state has targets for water systems to be in compliance with conservation standards. This is the number that they will use based on your population. It is not the number that is used to determine rates or to go into your billing. It's a whole different way to configure and identify if we as the city as a whole is meeting the per person use requirement. And LA, which has 15 million people, have the same 55 gallons per day requirement or 120 gallons per day requirement, whatever the state's standard is. This is the number that they will do as a quick reference and just see if they're meeting the per person use factor. You can't use this number because this number varies from household. One house of 3,000 square feet has one person living in it, and the next house next door has 2,200 square feet and 4 people living in it. So you can't use this gallons per capita day value to figure out a rate structure. It's not appropriate. And then the attachment number 4 represents what is being called a single-family residence, but in reality, this account is not a single-family residence. It's a multifamily account. It has 2 detached single-family dwellings located on one lot, served by 1 meter. So in the billing database, this account is considered a multifamily account, and it falls under a different billing sequence than does a single-family residence. So this, in this regard, this is not a single-family account, and what data is coming out of this account really needs to be compared to other multifamily residents, not single-family residents. Right now, our current data shows that multifamily residents are using, on the average, of 5.2 or 5.3 HCF per month. In this example, it's showing 10.5 HCF per month, so it's actually double the average of a multifamily unit dwelling for the city. So to consider this an equal to single family will distort the results. It's not an appropriate comparison.
If I might, since this is my property, 2 single-family units detached from one another on the same lot with 1 meter. So if you look at the calculation that I put forward for you to consider, it takes into account that there are 2 units. And it divides the total consumption, and it comes out to 10.5 HCF per unit.
Correct.
So I guess I don't understand your point that this is not an appropriate consideration, considering that they're 2 detached single-family units and served by 1 meter.
Because there are 2 addresses on that account. That makes it a multifamily account.
Okay, maybe I'm not expressing myself correctly here. Regardless of how you classify it, they're 2 single-family units, okay, served by 1 meter. And the total consumption is somewhere around 42 HCF. Simply divide that by the number of units, and you achieve the outcome. And so I don't understand why you don't think that this is a depiction of reality.
This particular account is considered a high user of water. So it does not equal or compare to the average single-family resident based on the meter's historical data throughout the city. If we look at just single-family residential, and there is a chart in here that will show that to you. Single-family residential has a 6.03 HCF average billing in this city currently. And in this particular account, you can call it a single family or 2 single family dwellings on 1 lot, but it's in reality, you're in the multifamily billing structure, and the use comparison, this account is using almost twice what the average is for a single family, and it is using twice what the average is for a multifamily. So in either comparison, whether we look at this account as a single family or a multifamily, it's still in the high use category. So to use something that's in a high use category and compare that, which is outside of a single family resident, to a known single family resident would not be an equal comparison. That's all I'm trying to express here.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. Attachment number 5 is the water blending options. Throughout the document that you requested information on, this document was referenced, I don't remember, a couple of times, this document was referenced. And again, I'd just like to point out that this document is not a water savings document based on the RO system being off or in bypass. This is simply the impact to the budget back in 14-15 when we first shut the plant down. If you notice the black values, those were actual values when the facility was online 100% and the membranes were in use. Then you see the blue values. Those are that is the period in which the values were estimated. And at the time, we were asked to come up with a spreadsheet that showed what the impact would be to the budget with the plant being in bypass, with the membranes being in bypass. So if we were to use and if you look at under option 1 in the far right, if we used a 70-30 split ratio with the approved budget up there and the goal of $3.2 million for that year, that fiscal year, if we did a 70-30 split ratio at the end of the fiscal year, we would have been somewhere around a little less than 400,000 under budget, under approved budget. However, if we go to option 3, as a comparison to option 1, if we did a 50-50 split between United and Cayugas Water, our cost would be $650,000 over the approved budget for that fiscal year. So there is a $1 million difference in operating just on how we determine what blend ratio we want. And that blend ratio will adjust water quality slightly, but it certainly will not provide the quality of water that the plant would produce when the membranes are online. So back in 14-15, the direction was, well, if we can't blend high enough to make the quality good enough, then why spend the extra money? So there's another side to that coin also, is if we stayed with option 1, if you look at the take or pay penalty provision that's listed there in option 1 and follow all the way over to the right-hand side, even if we did our best to take as much United as we wanted in 14-15, it was estimated that we'd pay $183,000 in penalties. I believe that year was $143,000 when it was all said and done. So the estimate was close. It was just kind of a, you know, what would it look like if we did do option 1 or option 3? And that's what this was representing. It has nothing to do with the amount of money saved by bypassing the membranes. I have another document available that can be passed out today that will show you what the actual dollar value is of operating the membranes for a year and the potential cost savings to the ratepayer. And that is up there in front of the box with there's 2 pages there, Rod. One is the math formula for determining the savings for the RO being in membrane, RO membranes being in bypass. And the second one is the new chart that shows today's values. What if we changed our blending ratios today? What would the cost impact be to the budget? This is no membrane use. It's strictly just, again, it's just a ratio of split between 15% to a 50-50 split. Again, these are all estimated values. It's just to show you that even today, if we look at option 1 and compare it to option 3, there's about $1 million, $1.2 million difference, just based on how much do we want to blend. So I just wanted to clarify that this particular spreadsheet or list of 4 options does not depict savings with the RO membranes being bypassed. It is strictly a blending ratio, budget impact type of document.
Mr. Hickox, I'm confused. If we're saying we're under budget by almost $500,000 with an 85-15 split, well, what is the budget? Is the budget also been programmed as an RO online expense?
This particular budget does not have the RO in operation. We've reduced our take down to the minimum allocation of 3470, and we did take the 500 acre foot use for Cayugas.
Okay, let's take a look at option 1. There's a $541,000 under budget. Well, what was the budget? What was anticipated with that budget?
It's in the gold box up above on the right-hand side.
That top one.
Right. Okay, but so I'm trying to get to when the city for the last 2 years has had a bypass situation with the facility, how much savings have been realized as a result of not being online?
This sheet shows the breakdown of cost associated with the membranes being online. And the anticipated cost is $150,000 a year savings.
That's savings.
Correct. And if you break it down, there's a formula there at the bottom. The $150,000 cost per year or savings. The city gets 56 or apportioned 56% of that through this member agency. Of the 1,620 acre foot that the city purchased, if you divide the $84,000 divided by 1,620, that'll equal $51.85 treatment cost per acre foot of water. And then if you take that acre foot number, 5185, and divide that by 325,851 gallons, which is how many gallons are in an acre foot, you'll get 0.000159 cents per gallon. And because we bill in HCF, we have to convert that into 100 cubic feet, which is multiplied by 748. And then that would ultimately end up resulting in a 12 cents per HCF saving to the customer. So if you get 6 HCF a month, if you're a single family resident average user in Port Hueneme, you're getting about a 60 cents per month savings. Which really is insignificant with the cost of running the RO. The cost came when we built the structure and built the system. That's where this does not take into account for the construction of the capital. This is strictly an annual operating expense associated with running the RO membranes.
Mr. Hickox, I think this is the first time we've ever seen this calculation before. Thank you for drilling down on it. Because the assumption has been that there should be much more in a cost savings per customer when the RO is not in operation.
Correct. And that's
right.
And that's because, and I have other supporting documents here to reference if need be.
But for your benefit, Madam Mayor Pro Tem, the reason I was dogging this issue is that I was asking these questions and it was dismissed summarily as if there was nothing to be saved. And that troubled me. We could quibble about what the conclusions are here, but that's why I have been very insistent is that, as we found out, there is savings. It may not be significant, that's our choice to deal with, but previously we were not being given a number that would reflect that actual savings. So that's the reason. Please continue.
Okay, and so that's why I wanted to have this one separated. I wanted to clearly define what was in the binder first, and knowing that the breakdown request would be coming as you requested, Mayor. I did do that calculation, and I think maybe some of the cloudiness or confusion of why there would be so much more savings than what it really is might be because this document was being used as a comparative for savings when the RO was not in service.
And just so we clarify, that chart you modified because the previous version you submitted to the Water Authority, which I relied upon, indicates that there is an online option. And that's the comparison I was making. And so then this came out recently and it had been modified, corrected, however you want to characterize it. So I was operating on information that I thought was reliable, that's all.
It is reliable information back in 2014 if it was used as a budget impact document. It is not reliable in 2014 or today if you use it as a RO savings. It's not the right methodology. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Again, Mr. Hickox, so just so you understand, is that the document that you're making reference to has been modified. And I was relying on it in good faith. And option 3, which was previously with treatment as the option, I was comparing that with the bypass operation, option number 1. So I just want you to be aware of how did I arrive at these conclusions.
I modified this document because I mentioned to you in our review that I sensed that you were looking at this document in that fashion. So I wanted to, I guess, update or mark off what isn't really occurring. If you look back at this document in 2014, the water treatment plant did run 6 months out of the year. So it did have RO treatment in that option for half the year.
Okay,
So,
let's move on.
Okay.
I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. This document has been modified. I was basing my analysis on misinformation, so I appreciate the fact that you've corrected it, but I think you need to understand, I hope you do, of why I've been so insistent on getting these numbers correct.
And I hope you understand why I'm being so insistent in informing you that this document is not the document to be using. And when I recognized that you were using it as that document, I did want to notify you that it was the improper document.
Okay, let's move on.
All right, thank you. Attachment 6, requested financial plan scenario. This really is kind of where we need to go today. And the consultant really needs, in order to provide us a working rate model, needs to come away today with this information. You are absolutely right, Mr. Fig. This is where we need to focus. Now, hopefully, that there's been some clarification in different points. There's been a review of the water master plan. We've touched on the water atlas. We've touched on the budget. We've touched on the rates. Now maybe we can get to the point where council can provide direction to the consultant with information that is supportive of the task here, and see if we can't finalize this rate model study and bring you the information that you need as a whole to determine what, if any, action is going to be taken with the rates. And so, unless there's any other questions, if there are more questions, I'll be happy to answer them. with my presentation.
Questions? John, oh, move forward.
And then I'll turn it over to Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, are we gonna have a presentation? Great, okay.
Yes.
I'll wait till, yeah, thanks.
While they're getting organized here, did you have any questions? We've reached another point in the agenda. We've completed some discussion, and we're moving into the last item. Did you want to address us on any questions you may?
Do I help myself to handouts because there's no handouts for the
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I'm assuming it's available to the public?
Actually, we got some extras as well.
And if,
otherwise I don't have questions.
and if I may, similar with Mr. Hensley, if any of the council, after you've had time to read the inquiry and comment section, if you have questions, feel free to contact me and we can go over them by item. At this time, I'll turn it over to Steve Gagnon for his presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Hope everyone still has an attention span. So now Mr. Villafana has given you background on the system, and Steve has taken care of certain questions that we'll be going through that we've been calling special questions. What I'm hoping for today is some direction. If Raftellus is going to complete its scope of work, which is to calculate and implement rates for the city, then we need direction and decisions from you. We were hoping for this last time we presented. We were hoping for direction, but we didn't get it. So today, I'm going to go through this presentation as a reminder, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly because we're going to be working together in the financial model today, and I'll show you the impacts of various questions known as the 5 special questions. And we're first going to look at your fund balances for this city and your costs, and we'll hopefully make some decisions about these special questions, and then we'll view the resulting rates, okay? And if you don't like the rates, or you think they're not tolerable or what have you, we can back up and we can change the decisions that we've made in the financial plan. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but in the model, we project your costs in the future. And so what we're doing is we're taking your fiscal year 2017 actual costs, and I'm noting this because 9 times out of 10 when we do rates, we usually take your budgeted costs. But we know that actual costs often run under budget. So this is an advantage to your consumer that we're using your actual costs instead of your budget. So we take your fiscal year 2017 actual costs and we project them forward with various inflation factors that are shown in this table here. Okay, so, and we're setting your rates with the costs in fiscal year 2018. Okay, so that's known as the test year. So we take a snapshot in time and we say, what are the city's costs in fiscal year 2018? And we set rates with that year. And so in the circle here, last time I presented, this was 0 because the PHWA's budget was in limbo, but we have since received more information that has actually said that PHW rates are going down. So this is a benefit to your consumer. The fixed portion of PHW rates are going down 12%, and the variable rate is going down 4%. This has now been reflected in the model for your costs that you pay to PHWA. And then in the future, in 2019 and out, we inflate all those costs using those inflationary factors on the right side of the table. Okay? This is simply saying that your rates are based on your costs, so we're going to go through the special questions today that were part of the request for proposal for this project, and they have to do with your costs. So I'm hoping that you will make decisions today about these special questions, and I'm going to go through them. Prop 218 says that your rates need to be based on your costs. So I'm leading you in this particular direction because we want to basically try to avoid picking rates, okay? Because your rates need to reflect your costs. So normally what we do is we analyze your costs. We say, okay, what do you pay for O&M? What are you paying for debt service? How much are you paying to fund your reserves? What are you paying for capital? That specifies your costs, and then we develop rates to collect those costs. Okay? Okay, so we'll talk about the 5 special questions, and then we'll work in the model and see and take a look at rates. Okay? So here are the 5 special questions that we need to answer today, and you'll see how they affect your reserve balances in the model. Special question number 1 was the question of that the city in the past has not been paying for its water. So we were asked, how much does the city owe? At the kickoff meeting, we decided 3 years was how far we're going to go back into time. So Raftellus looked at what the city owed over 3 years, and we reasonably think it's about $800,000. So the question that needs to be answered is, should we reduce the principal of the loan from the general fund to the water enterprise by $800,000?
If I might, I think the question also is, why are we going back to at least when the rates changed in 2008? Why 3 years?
Well, at the kickoff meeting, that's what we decided on, 3 years. I initially said, based on my understanding, 1 year, but then the people in the room, including yourself, sir, said, let's go back 3 years, and we all decided to go back 3 years. And I believe that's because if the city were to have to refund its ratepayers, it could only go back 3 years. And I look to your city attorney to actually make that determination, but that's my
Well, that would be in
understanding.
the case somebody was to litigate the city, that they
Right.
could only collect back to 3 years. But that doesn't mean that this council doesn't have the authority to go back further. Okay, so when you make a statement that, you know, that's the only question here, I think that the question is how much of a benefit should be given back to the ratepayers for this practice that has been going on indefinitely. And I just want, you know, that is another option because it will definitely have an effect on the rates. The other thing is that in our study session, you were thinking closer to 1.2 million was the savings. How did this number come to be?
So the 1.2 million, come to find out after speaking with Al, was for all your utilities, not just water. The 800K is just for water.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to have to make a decision on that one. Special question number 2 has to do with the general fund loan interest rate, which was made back in 2008 at about 5%. And current interest rates are lower, and the question is, shall we refinance the loan to about 2.87%, which was the 30-year Treasury rate about a month or 2 ago? Okay, so we'll have to make that decision. Special question number 3, which Mr. Hickox just addressed, is shall we shut down, so to speak, the RO treatment, which saves about $90,000 to $100,000 in costs a year, and you'll see the impact on your reserve balances when we get into the model. Special question number 4, and this is the gorilla in the room because it has the biggest effect on your rates, is how much do you want to invest in your system, in your capital, okay? And now we have the background from Mr. Villafana that discusses, you know, fire flow and the age of your pipes. And we have in the model a couple of different...
$30 million, right?
I'm sorry?
This is where we're trying to get after the $30 million.
Yes.
Where we're going to identify those funds.
Yes, so we have a couple of scenarios in the model, sort of pre-programmed for you, if you will, but you could choose any amount in the model. We have a cell in there that if you wanted to say do 30% of your full CIP, you could do so. So you can choose any degree of CIP investment. But what we have to start off is you have a full staff recommended CIP, which was provided by city staff, and that is $33 million over 5 years. I should point out that that $33 million is in today's dollars. And by the time you get done your projects 5 years from now, it's going to be more than that. So in the model, we account for inflation, 3%. And if you see a different number when we use the full staff recommended CIP, and let's say it's 36 million, that's because of inflation, okay? We also have a water master plan CIP, which Mr. Villafana described, that was performed by the AKM Consulting Engineers. And he described those 9 different projects. What we assumed was the city is doing one of those projects every year over the next 9 years. And I believe the timing of the projects is slightly different than what staff has submitted. So over the next 5 years, that's $19 million in today's dollars. I put this third one called no CIP up there because that's what we presented the last time I was here. There was a consideration of what if we do no CIP? So you can see the rates today if you were to decide we're not investing at all in the system. And then, of course, like I said, you could choose anything else, something in between if we'll work on that today. Special question number 5 has to do with how much fixed revenue shall the city collect through its fixed charge. Special question number 5 doesn't have to do with how much revenue you're collecting, but rather the manner in which you're collecting it. Okay, now I want to make sure you understand this. So in the financial plan, we're going to decide how much you collect, but then when you make the decision on this, you're deciding how you're going to collect it. And your fixed charge can be high, low, or somewhere in between. Currently, you have a fairly high fixed charge so that you collect 59% of your revenue through a fixed charge, meaning that it doesn't matter how much water the customer uses, they still pay a certain fixed amount, okay? The Southern California average is, in my research, I found it to be about 26%. Of course, we don't poll all agencies, so I round that. Let's just say 26 to 30% is about the average percent of fixed revenue collected by water agencies in California. And then we could do something in between. We could do a midpoint. You're currently at, I'm rounding here, you're currently at about 60%. Let's call 30% the floor, being the average of all other agencies. If you wanted to go halfway in between, you could do a 45% fixed charge. And you'll see how that affects a typical single-family bill when we're in the model, okay? But if you were to choose 30% fixed revenue, then that means that people who don't use a lot of water will get a lower bill compared to your current bill because it's more tied to their use, okay?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So if we were to make the change for the fixed cost, would then, so someone's bill would be predicated on what their variable, what their usage would be, but would then the charge for that water somehow have to be adjusted up because of the cost of water for?
Yeah, so what we do first, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, is first we decide how much money you're going to collect. Let's say it's $7 million. Then we design a system of rates, a fixed charge and a volumetric charge, so that at the end of the day you collect the same amount of money. Let's say $7 million. But if we lower the fixed charge, then that means your volumetric rate has to go up. Right. If we increase your fixed charge, then your volumetric rate comes down. So that at the end of the day, it's revenue neutral. The city is still collecting $7 million. Yeah. The only thing that differs is how people are paying for it.
Yes, thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. The other thing that we can modify, and this was a question in one of the mayor's questions, Steve, is that your reserves. What you set as your reserve targets will affect your financial plan and how much money you need every year. And right now, in the model, we have a capital reserve set at 10% of your water system asset value, valued at reproduction cost less depreciation, which is about $2.2 million. Okay, and 10% is actually a little high. We normally use 2 to 5%. But if we use, let's say, 2%, I think your asset value is a little low. So if we use 2%, that means that your reserve goal for capital only would be $440,000, which isn't a lot. You can't do a heck of a lot with $440,000. That's why I've taken the liberty to adjust it up to something that kind of passes the smell test. You know, and a typical way of assessing a reserve is take your average CIP over the course of, let's say, 5 years. So looking at the bottom chart there, if you were to do the full city CIP, you see you're doing 9 million, 6 million, 4 million, 11 million, and so on. If you take the average of that, it's about 7 million. So if you did a full city CIP, one could say you should be holding around 6 or 7 million in reserve. Why do you have reserves? So you can have, for a couple of reasons. One, so you can award contracts. You have the cash in-house to award the contracts in a timely manner. And of course, for natural disasters too. If there were a natural disaster, you couldn't do a heck of a lot with $440,000, okay? If you do the Water Master Plan CIP, the average of that, it's the second line in the table down there, the average of that is about 4 million, okay? So I've adjusted this capital reserve to 10% so that you get something reasonable for your capital reserve. You could make the decision today, I'm looking for input from you. What do you want to have as your capital reserve? You could have 5%, you could have any number in between, but I would not use 2% because that just isn't much a reserve. So you'll have to answer that today or leave it at 10. I would probably say don't go below 5 just so that the reserve passes the smell test, so to speak.
What gets us to the $4 million mark?
So the 4 million, that's the summation of, you actually have two reserves. You have an O&M reserve, which is 25% of your operating expenses, and that's very typical across all water agencies. So that, if you look in 2A, 25% of your operating expenses is about 1.7 million in reserves. And then if you add the capital reserve to it of 10% of your asset value, that's 2.2. So 2.2 plus 1.7 equals the 4 million. So I'm just saying if you left it as is right now, the summation of both of those reserves would be 4 million, and you'll see that in a graph in a second when we get in the model.
And this is collecting 4 million over 5 years?
Per year over
per
5
year?
years.
No, I'm just saying that I hope it'll become more apparent when we look at the financial plan graph. But what we're saying is that when we're adjusting your rates, when we make decision about your rates, we're aiming to set your rates such that over a period of years, let's call it 5 years, at the end of that period, you will have 4 million in the bank.
That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
Was the 4 million over 5 years
Yes.
collected? Okay, thank you.
Yes. I'm going to go through this very quickly.
Can I ask
yeah.
a question about this?
Absolutely.
Were the reserves in place in the last rate-setting exercise?
Yes, there was a line in the rates.
What were we charging there?
I believe $1 million a year. It started out at 450,000 and then incremented up to 750,000 and then to $1 million. And then it flatlined at $1 million.
So we have a reserve right now. What's the balance?
About 10 million.
10 million? Okay, so now all right, we have a reserve that's far in excess of what your target is right now.
Yes, but if you do a lot of capital investment, you're going to use those reserves.
Eat it up real quick.
Yeah.
But that's, and that's from what, 2008 to now,
Correct.
right? So, I mean,
It took us
it's
9
over.
years to get there.
Yeah, see, so you have to
If
factor
you-
that in too.
Yeah. If you were to choose to not do any capital investment, then yes, you could use those reserves and essentially buy down your rates.
Okay. Did you want to address this?
I did. Sometimes I'm simple-minded, so I apologize for that. But when you're thinking about capital improvement funds and also looking at all the projects we looked at earlier that are urgent, and where I come from, you kind of need to know your Standard & Poor's ratings so you know how much a bond would cost if you floated to pay partial capital improvements along with whatever can be weaned out of the capital reserve fund. Thanks. And I don't know, I don't know if you have a treasurer here, but I don't know what your Standard & Poor's rating is for bonds. And I think that would be really important because of the interest that they would be charging. Anybody know that?
I believe we're currently in the A, not AAA, which is the best, but A minus or double A minus. It's actually pretty good within Ventura County.
Okay, so, I mean, is that going to be considered in your long-range planning for capital improvement?
If we do loans, or
It more or less has to be.
if we have.
If I understand your question is, are we intending to bond for these improvements?
No, I mean, I think that your reserves needs to be used for a great deal of it, but I also think you need to float a bond. And, I mean, that's, what do I know? This is what I see other people doing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Please continue.
Okay, so this may come in handy if we get into the detail about how your rates are set, is that we take your costs, which is in the gray bucket. This is called cost of service. This is how we set rates. And we do a cost allocation exercise. We take your costs and we allocate them to each of these different buckets, which are called cost causation components. And then we distribute these costs to each customer class, so we know how much each customer class needs to pay: single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, what have you. So in each of these different buckets, in this bucket here, where my cursor is going up and down, you have the cost to get and treat water. We do our best we can to take any cost that has to do with getting and treating water and put it in that bucket. And I lost, oh, it's back, okay. And then the cost in this bucket is the cost to deliver water through your distribution system during times of average flow. And I make that distinction because another bucket has to do with delivering water during peak times of flow, okay? This bucket, the pink bucket, has to do with any conservation costs you may have. This bucket has to do with distributing water during peak times of flow, when your water is flowing above average daily demand, okay? I'll talk more about that in the next slide. And then we have, in the purple bucket, we have meter maintenance costs. That is the cost to repair and replace all the meters you have in the ground. And lastly, we have the customer service bucket, and that's the cost to bill customers, answer customer calls, and also read your meters. Okay, so 95% of the time, we take these two costs buckets, if you will, and put them in the fixed charge. And you'll see that in a second. And then 95% of the time, we take these three types of costs and we collect them from your customers through a volumetric rate. And then you remember when we were talking about how much fixed revenue you want? What we do is we take the costs in this green bucket and we collect some of it through the fixed charge, and we collect some of it through the volumetric rate, and we adjust how much we collect through the fixed charge to meet your fixed revenue goals. Okay, so if you were to say, Raftelis, we want to stay at our 59% fixed revenue, then we would take a heck of a lot of that peaking cost in that green bucket and we would collect it through a fixed charge. Okay?
Can you go back to that
Yeah.
one? So when a city has tiered effects, is it in the volumetric? It's in the volumetric, right?
When a city has tiered rates, yes, it's a volumetric rate, yes. And what we do is we use the supply bucket, the base bucket, the conservation bucket, and the extra capacity bucket. Each one of those has a rate associated with it, and you add each one of those up to get the total rate in each tier. And actually, I have a slide on that I'll show you. We did that exactly for Port Hueneme for your tiered rates. to talk a little bit more about peaking costs is that peaking costs have to do, we all know that the water system has different flows during the day. Everybody wakes up at 7 a.m., takes a shower, the water system is flowing faster at that point in time than it is at, say, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So there's daily flows, daily peaks, monthly peaks, seasonal peaks during the summer. I know you don't have a lot of lawns, but during the summer people use a little more water here in Port Hueneme. So there's peaks in the water system. The concept here is that we want to make sure, or we're saying that certain customer classes contribute more to the peak flows, so to speak. So your commercial customer class, you know, your Subway, your jewelry store, all that, their water use throughout the day and throughout the year is pretty flat. So they don't really contribute to peaking costs. But single family, irrigation, especially, you know, they have their peak flows during the summer when they're trying to keep the grass green. So they get allocated a little bit more of these peaking costs. Okay, so it's the concept that not all classes contribute equally to peaking costs, and we just want to reflect that in the rate structure. And these peaking factors, by the way, are right from your water master plan. So I just want to, I don't know if we'll get into it, but I want to at least mention the idea of peaking costs and the fact that not all customer classes contribute equally to peaking costs. Okay, this is your current rate structure. You currently have a fixed charge by meter size for commercial and irrigation accounts. And then for residential and small business, you have a fixed charge and then a volumetric rate. Okay, that's your current rate structure. And what we're suggesting, what Raftellus is suggesting based on cost of service principles, which are those buckets we just went through, is we're suggesting to get rid of this multi-unit residential flat charge. Okay, so you would have a simple two-component rate structure. It would be a fixed charge based on your meter size, and then a volumetric rate based on which customer class you're in. Okay? The reason why we're suggesting to remove this flat charge for multifamily, again, goes back to cost of service, because if you remember those two cost buckets on the right, the customer billing cost bucket, and then the meter maintenance bucket, that is a good portion of what goes into the fixed charge. And when we ask ourselves for multifamily, do they have their own meter? The answer is no. So they can't be allocated meter maintenance costs. Do they get their own bill? No. So they can't be allocated customer billing costs. So that's why we're suggesting, based on cost of service principles, to get rid of that flat charge. So like I said, your rate structure will consist of a fixed charge by meter size and a volumetric rate which varies by class. So let me give you an example. This is the fixed charge by meter size. In this column, the bolded column right here where my cursor is going up and down, this is just an example, by the way. These aren't your rates, because you're going to answer those 5 questions which are going to affect your rates. I'm only showing you an example of the fixed charge by meter size. Okay, so this column in the bold is a proposed monthly fixed charge. I'm just waiting to get my cursor back here, and it's not coming back, but it's the summation of the meter service charge on the left, the $33.54, and then the customer bill charge on the right. You add those two together. There it is. You add these two together, and you get this proposed fixed charge by meter size, and it goes up in proportion to the potential flow in the meter. Okay?
So I had a question. So I think previously when we looked at this, it was the size of the pipe, was it, Steve?
It was the size of the meter also, but
And
it's just at a different value.
Okay, but it would be correlated to then, if somebody has, then the larger it would be for a commercial or the port.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, same principle applies, mainly due because of the larger size has the capacity to take larger amounts
Right,
in
okay.
a shorter period of time.
Okay,
Another question too. Our meter charges here in Hueneme, how do they compare to Oxnard, Ventura, other cities? About the same?
I haven't compared them, but I could look at them.
I'd be interested to
Just
find
by
out.
gut, well, you have right now, your current charge is $37, your flat charge.
Mhm.
And I'm used to seeing things in the 20s and 30s, so I mean, it's not.
From other cities, so
Yeah, yeah,
more standard.
yeah.
I'd like to see the numbers when you get time.
Okay, so that is your fixed charge by meter size. And then you will have a volumetric rate. And for your single family and multifamily, we're proposing a 3-tier volumetric rate with the following breakpoints for each tier. Okay, so tier 1 would have a rate, and we have a bi-monthly breakpoint there and a monthly breakpoint. And these breakpoints are based on what you could call an indoor water need. Okay, because what we did is we looked at your water use during the winter. We found the minimum month and found what the average water use is during that winter month, the minimum winter month. So the idea here is that during that month, when there's very minimal outdoor use, it's mostly indoor water use. So it's a de facto indoor water budget, so to speak. Does that make sense? And then for tier 2, we did the same thing, but we looked at your max summer month and saying that this is a reasonable outdoor water use need, because we picked the maximum summer month, probably August or September, and we said, okay, on average, what are single-family users using during that max month of water use? And it's 7. So the first tier will stop at 4, the second tier will stop at 7, and the third one is anything beyond 7. And this is quite common what we do for many agencies. It's a de facto indoor breakpoint and an outdoor breakpoint. Any questions there? No? I'm not gonna talk about this one because we talked about it. It's just peaking. On the line there, you see your commercial class usually peaks the least, irrigation the most. So here's an example volumetric rate. Okay, and if you remember the buckets from the cost of service slide, we had the first one, the cost to get and treat water, the cost to deliver water during average flow, the peaking bucket, and then the conservation bucket. You add all 3 of those up to get your total rate in this column here. And you can see that the peaking rate is a function of the peaking factor for each tier and each class. So we derive your peaking factor based on water use records that the city provided us. So those peaking rates are a function of how each tier and class peaks on the water system. I think I'll leave it at that. Are there any questions on this? No?
Nope.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the dashboard, and now we got to answer these questions, these 5 special questions. I think this was already open. Okay. I trust you can see that okay on your screen. So here we have what's known in the model as the financial dashboard. It's the command center, so to speak, and you have 4 different graphs. Now, let me explain what these graphs are. The first one is very simple. It's just a bar chart showing the revenue adjustments for each fiscal year. So in this bar here, this very top bar called water revenue adjustment, if we were to come in here in this exact cell in fiscal year 2018, right now I have 2.5%. This simply means that we are going to collect 2.5% more revenue in fiscal year 2018 compared to fiscal year 2017. We haven't talked about the rate structure yet. We'll get into that in a second. But this says we're going to adjust your revenue to collect 2.5% more revenue. If I were to put in a 0 here, this means that there is no, you will, in 2018, you won't collect any more revenue than you did in 2017. And then that's the same for each fiscal year afterwards. So if you see 2.5% here, this means, let's put it back to 2.5%, simply means that each year your rates are collecting 2.5% more revenue compared to the prior year. I just want you to understand now what that line does, okay? This next line here is if you're going to issue debt, which we'll use in a second. And then over on the right, you have a graph, which the bars, the stacked bars, are your expenses. Okay, so the green are your reserves. So for this particular year in 2018, what this is saying is that you're using reserves because it's in the negative, it's below the x-axis. Okay, and then you have blue, which is water supply costs. So the blue bar is the cost to get your water and treat it. The purple is other water O&M, you know, staff and vehicles and whatever goes in that cost category. And then the pink or peach is your debt service. And then this, I guess this would be peach, is your capital. So what this is, and then the two lines are your, the red line is your current revenue. Okay, so if Raftellus wasn't here, you weren't doing a rate study, that is how much revenue you would currently be collecting. The green line is your proposed revenue based on the revenue adjustments here. So let's just say we wanted to collect 25% more revenue. You see how that green bar went up because you've now adjusted your revenue, okay? So what this is saying here is that, let's pick a year, let's pick 2018, is saying that you're only getting so much revenue in 2018, so your costs are more than your revenue, so you're using reserves. That's why your reserves are below the x-axis. Okay, so that's that graph. This next graph is simply your capital that you're choosing to do. So in this particular scenario, I have it set on the AKM Water Master Plan. So over the course of the next 5 years, you're doing 4.8 and 7.9 and 1.8. I can't actually read those numbers, but whatever they are, you're doing this much capital over the next 5 years. So this graph simply shows your capital. And then this is probably the most important one. This is your water enterprise ending balances. This is your total ending balances. And remember, we were talking about reserves before. This red line is the summation of both your O&M reserve and your capital reserve. And the blue line is just your O&M reserve. So, we're endeavoring to set rates such that at the end of this 5-year or 6-year period, hopefully your reserves are somewhere around this red line. Okay? So that explains the graphs. And then up here in this blue area, we have, I think most of the special questions are here. So let's, for example, choose to do the full, first take a look at this graph down here on the right, the one with the green bars, your total ending reserve balances, okay? So let's say the council makes a decision to say, we're going to do the full city CIP. See what happened to your reserves? So what this is saying is that if you did the full city CIP, which is $36 million over 5 years, and you did 2.5% revenue adjustments, you would be in the red very quickly. Okay? So I think now, hopefully I've explained this, and I'll now say, now it's the time to answer some of these questions because, for example, over here I have your current debt service, okay? If you were to make the decision to say, let's refinance, look at the green bars on the bottom right corner there. It's very subtle, but it's going to help your reserves a little bit. You see how they all moved up a little bit? So your cash balance is a little better. So in order to set remember here, we're deciding on how much revenue you need. Once we make a decision, once we're done with this, we'll go look at rates. And if there's, you know, if you pull out the Tums and it's too much to bear, we'll come back here, make some different decisions, and then go look at the rates. We'll do that maybe however many times. And the goal here is that we all come away with an ending point to do the Proposition 218 here. So let's start with the first question. RO on or RO off? This saves about $100,000 a year. Watch your green on the bottom right. If I say RO off, they all moved a little bit. Okay? So I guess that's the first question we need to answer. Should we assume that the RO system will be on or off?
Off.
I have a question. That to me sounds like an engineering question. I mean, if we've got the quality input, then we can have the RO on. If we're projecting we're going to get the same quality of input, then we're in a situation where it'll be off.
Correct. And there is some signs of better water quality in the pipeline right now, but not enough to say that it's enough to turn the membranes back on. There's a couple of factors that we need to look at. One is longevity. The demand, as you know, the weather has changed. It's gotten cooler. So the United Water Conservation District is no longer having to run the deep wells as long or at all in order to meet demands. So that's a good thing. If next week, which they're predicting, I think we're supposed to get back to 80 or 85 or something like that, they may need to turn the wells back on. So we're kind of in that on-off period right now, so there's nothing really sustainable at this point. So long-term, if you're looking for majority of the year, at this point I would have to say off.
You know, certainly adding to what you just said, Mr. Hickox, the Port Hueneme Water Agency has been looking at possibility of having United put in something that would actually process the water before it hits us. So then, but I think we're outside of like at least a 3-year window to get that accomplished. So that if we're looking at this rate study for the next 5 years, then maybe it would be something that would be RO on, but in the later years
in
versus
the middle
earlier. Yeah.
Time frame.
Yeah.
In the middle time frame, that would be able to run sustainably. Again, running the membranes for a week and shutting them off, and running them for a month and shutting them off, it's not helpful.
Yeah.
And I imagine there would be a lifespan of the membranes as well, maintenance, and who
Yes.
knows when we're gonna pull these out, replace them, et cetera. So I'd just soon turn them off.
Is that where we're at? Okay. Next.
Okay, the next question.
Oh, I'm sorry, we have a,
I know you. I'm
would you
sorry
like
for
to sit
constantly
up here?
interrupting.
We do have a
I
chair.
know I'm interrupting a great deal, but anyways, Mayor, you threw this out a couple months ago at a meeting. Do you want to treat our water, or do you want to use the point of view system and have everybody in town put in? I don't know if those salting things take care of the problem, or if you have to have a full house RO system, but it seems, as I looked at it, it seemed to me that having the residents put in their own point of use water cleaning is actually cheaper for the residents than facing all the city is facing as far as getting potable water.
And leaves the choice with them too. They can choose if they can afford to do that.
Well, you'd have to cut us a break if we put it in. I mean, I think a lot of people are running those, I don't know what you call those salt tanks, because I have the RO filter, but I heard that would clean up the water just as much as my RO filter does. But I don't know, because I don't have the salt thing. I know it wrecks the groundwater. But I mean, it seems to me a decision has to be made before you can answer this gentleman's question.
Okay, next question.
Okay. So the next question would be, what shall we, at least for now, for the purpose of viewing rates, do with the debt? Should we keep it? Should we keep your current debt service and not touch anything? Or should we reduce the principal by $800,000? Should we refinance the 2.87%? Should we refinance and reduce the principal by $800,000? Or leave it alone?
The 800,000, have we calculated the effects on the general fund?
I have not.
Well, that's outside your scope, but I wonder if anybody has.
I don't know if Al got into that. I know that we had talked about when you were collecting the data, but I don't know if he actually completed looking at what the impact would be to the general fund.
Yeah, it would just depend on how much time it was spread over, and that would probably be a policy call of the council.
Yeah, if it were, if we're sufficiently amortized, I would have no problem with that. Or if it's coming out of the principal and that affects the payback, or if it were going to be, the other alternative, I suppose, would be to invest it in the capital improvement plan, which and there again, I don't know about an $800,000 chunk. If it would be an amortization question, I think, and I don't, if we have, I don't have enough information to really answer that.
Yeah, it's interesting because if we took a look at, do we want to collect $4 million over 5 years? The 800,000 deals with at least 1 year. If we look at it from that standpoint, is that the money just goes over into the capital improvement? That would be year one, right?
No, go ahead. Oh, I think it's more ideological than it is, getting your calculator out. People were paying for something they weren't receiving. Okay, so it's a philosophy issue, and even though it may impact the general fund, the reality is that we shouldn't have received that money anyway. And so I'm in favor of, and we'll talk about the duration of the calculation, but to reduce the principal of the outstanding loan between the water enterprise account and the general fund. And we then recast the loan on a lower interest rate, which is so it's a double calculation there. Reduction of outstanding debt and a recalculation based on a lower interest rate. Now, I don't have an answer for you in terms of what the impact would be to the general fund, but in my view, there's two things here going on. One is that we're trying to square up our ledger, so to speak, between our ratepayers that were overcharged, in effect, for municipal water purposes. The second issue has to do with, isn't it kind of our responsibility to get the best possible deal on financing, because that affects rates? We just did that with the refunding of the tax increment or tax allocation bonds. That's true, right? And that's the same principle here, is that why should we deny the ratepayers the opportunity of a lower interest rate, which means that they'll see it in a reduction in their bill. So that's my thinking, is that yes, we use a figure, whatever that, and we can talk about that secondly, to reduce the principal and then recast the principal at a lower interest rate. So that's my thinking.
So just remember that you can change your mind, and so what I'm thinking of doing is I'm going to set it on reduce and refinance, and we can look at rates and...
Well, Mr. Mayor, I believe the enterprise fund is in better shape than the general fund, and one of my prime objectives here is to protect the general fund. That's why I had the question on the paying back the $800,000. Not going to argue that that shouldn't be done. But I do not support refinancing the loan. I think it should stay at the rate it is at. It's how many years are left on that?
I would have to defer that to Finance Department.
We have
Goes
the
to
answer in the model somewhere, just give me
Yeah.
a
No, it's in
second.
there, so I forgot.
Goes to 2034 or 2035,
Yeah, it's not, you know.
mid-2030s.
Yeah, so
Well, it's at
Medium
least the
long term.
next 10 years, because it's more than 10 years.
It's more than 10 years.
Yeah. And who knows what rates are going to be, and it was set at 5 at the time, which was, you know, normalized, and yeah, you know, I don't, just in the interest of, you know, part of the purpose was to protect the interest, protect the general fund, and I don't support refinancing that, so that's one vote.
My concern would be equal to what Councilmember Sharkey has said.
Explain to me the damage to the general fund when we refinance.
Well, the loan is between the city and the water enterprise account, okay? And the debt is, I don't know, 14 million, I think is what the outstanding balance is. So it's earning 5% right now to the water fund. Or excuse me, it's just the opposite.
To the general fund.
That's right. So the city is being repaid at 5% interest of whatever the balance of the loan
Which is not a realistic interest. That's a made-up
Well,
number.
today it's, I mean,
Have to-
in my view, I think we've already made a concession in that we could also go all the way back to what has been our overall portfolio performance. It's closer to the LAIF rate, which is about 1% or less. The Treasury bill rate it represents if, in fact, you were to finance a 30-year project, this is the rate you could expect. So I'm kind of compromising already. I mean, arguably, we should be even lower and take a look at our historical earnings in our financial portfolio. But I'm willing to go the rate that's out there in the marketplace. And I think, again, ideologically, the general fund takes a hit, but then again, we're making our ratepayers whole. In other words, you know, we're refunding what they should have. So anyway, what I'm hearing here is that we got some, you know, concerns about the impact of the general fund.
Appreciate that too. I think we have a 2-2 here.
Yeah. So if we have an impasse, that's fine. That means we don't have to talk about how far back in time do we go to give the ratepayers a benefit. Okay, I'm just, that simplifies things. We don't have to talk about it.
Okay.
All right, so let's move on. We don't have an answer.
We'll have to wait for another council member to return.
Okay.
And we'll also want to take a look at what the numbers will ultimately, you know, translate to a hit on the general fund.
Sure.
Mr. Gagnon, are you going to discuss the possibility of bond financing later in this, or?
Yes, if you choose to do the full city CIP, you will have to issue bonds. And about to the tune of about 16 million, and we'll put that in the model.
Okay.
If you
Well,
want to do the
the
full.
reason I was asking is I think that the point that the mayor was making is quite pertinent, which is that we have, if not historic lows, we have near historic low interest rates on municipal bonds right now. And if the council decides that it needs to finance the CIP, this would be the time to do it. That's a policy decision, but I'm just saying that we have a historic opportunity in terms of reducing the cost to the ratepayers of having to do that. And so I just wanted to make sure you're going to cover it and that the council, you know, had in mind that this is a very, very cheap time to issue bonds, the lowest in my career, really.
So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to leave it on current debt service for now then. So I believe we have 3 more decisions to make. One is where do you want to set your capital reserve? Right now I have it at 10% of your asset value, which means that your red bar is right here. If you were to lower that to say maybe 5%, you'll see the red bar drop, which is your target reserve goal. See that? It just dropped a little bit. So do you want to adjust your capital reserve goal or leave it at 10%? And if so, what do you would like to see?
So if we could, my question would be here is that if we collect closer to an amount that we need, there's still like gap with what we want to do versus what we're collecting. And so if the number's set higher, that means that we would possibly be floating bonds that would be less in terms of total cost versus more if that number starts dropping. Yeah. Okay. So either way, we have to, is it the cash that we have, or do we borrow in order to put these projects together?
And I think that one of the points that Mr. Gagnon made, which is an equity thing, is that if you finance it, what you do is you spread that burden over the generations who are receiving the benefit. If you just try and pay for it out of cash, then in a way you're really sticking it to the people now who didn't necessarily cause this situation and who would have to pay the cost. So as a matter of I guess I would say principle, I think it's wise for you to at least consider doing bonds and spreading the cost, which will have a much better effect on the current ratepayers. Spread the cost, which is equitable, and do it at a rate which is probably not going to be seen again for a long time.
So then, taking that into consideration, maybe this is the last number we deal with. Maybe this is the plug number that we say, okay, this is where we feel comfortable with, and this is where we then start really maybe affecting more of the rates with this calculation.
Well, let me understand that this is just the reserve. And
Yes.
this is on top of whatever we choose to set a target for funding the capital projects.
Yes, this is
So this
just,
is like, in the event we have a break in a line.
Yeah.
This is what the
All's-
reserve is for.
right, all we're doing here with this particular question is we're identifying a target amount that we want in the bank. This is, which affects your rates, because if you want that much in the bank, you may have to
Yeah.
raise your rates.
Yep.
So, for demonstration, shall I leave it at 10? or
Well, let me
5?
ask this. If we do a bond, is it possible that the bond can include an allocation for replacement as needed? In other words, that we don't have an annual reserve that we accumulate, but rather a portion of the bond is set aside for that purpose.
Yeah, I think you're referring to a debt service reserve, and to my knowledge, most agencies do have a debt service reserve.
I don't think it's a debt service reserve.
No, I wouldn't
No?
call it that.
Okay.
I think what this is when you do your waterfall of funds and use of funds, it's a portion that is set aside for future needs for the system. And I've seen it done. I don't know if it could be done in this particular instance, because it's gonna really get down to underwriting criteria. But it's quite common when you're doing subdivisions, for example, to set aside pots of money to do phases of streets and gutters and water improvements and all that kind of thing. So I would suspect that would be possible. As long as the purpose of the principal that you're getting is for the water system and is restricted to that, their real question then is there a source of repayment? Which just means that you have to factor in the cost of the debt service into the rate, and then they will, I think, be happy with that. Underwriters, I mean.
Yeah, and the other factor is that most bond measures I've been involved in have a sunset. In other words, you got to spend the money within a fixed period of time. Now, whether or not we can have a reserve over the life of the bond, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it certainly would allow us to spread that expense over a longer period of time than set it at 10% or 5% and collect it on an annual basis.
It might be a good idea, Mr. Mayor, to have the city manager and the interim city finance director to investigate what your options are on
Yeah,
bonds.
I think that would be-
That'd be a great planning tool for you to have in hand.
Makes sense? Okay.
So do we stay at 5 or go up to 10?
Well, I think we're getting to a point where a lot of this, we're not going to be able to finish. I would, if we're preferential to taking advantage of bond rates, why not include an allocation for a capital reserve?
Which would mean,
And then, let's say 0 in your calculation here.
So no capital reserve.
That's correct.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it matters that much either way, but as a placeholder, I mean, I don't see why we don't stay where it is.
Well, I'm just saying that if we do a bond, the idea here
Yeah,
is
well,
that
then we can change it, depending on, as the attorney says, underwriting criteria and things like that. We can always change it, but for right now, just leave the plug in.
Sort of a
10%.
thought to keep in mind too is that you might want to come up with sort of a compromise number, because you have work to be done to get ready for the capital improvements that won't be in hand while you're working on the bonds. If you keep, I don't know, a couple $1 million of the reserve, use that for the design work and the prep work that Mr. Villafana was discussing, that helps you move your project further. It might be refundable in the bond, or it might not, but if you keep that money, that gives you a jump start on getting the work done.
Yeah, so I would say that maybe at this point here is that we don't drop it to 5, but maybe somewhere in the middle.
Okay, I was thinking 7.5
Yeah.
would give you like 4 million or something, so,
1.51.
okay.
But why are we doing that? Because if we already have a capital reserve right now, about $9 million, we can simply reserve that money, take the balance, and that would write down the CIP and reduce the amount of the bond.
Right. That's as opposed to refunding any money to the general fund, though. So
That's true.
I think that's a policy decision of how you want to do it. You're kind of taking it and giving it out of the same pockets, which
Yes,
is if you
that's true.
give them a benefit of writing down the rate, they're getting a benefit, but then they're going to pay more on the debt service. And I think that the real result is the current ratepayers probably get more of a break, because they're going to have the benefit of the pay down, unless you pay it out over a period of time. But I don't know how that would work. But at this point it starts to become less and less important, because you're going to address the problems with the system, and you're going to do it at a very low rate, which is a benefit. And I think you find a way in there to find some equity for people. I think you have some options to maybe move it, or move part of it, or do whatever seems right.
So where I think we're going to end up going here, we can complete the exercise, but there's still some homework that needs to be done.
Okay.
And for instance, we haven't got to the CIP.
Right.
And
Well, I'm
we're only
saving
talking
that
about a
for
5-year
last.
period, but if that was stretched out over 30 or whatever the time frame is, then, and we have some questions about the CIP in terms of, maybe there are other alternatives, like the emergency backup system instead of at the expense of replacing lines. I think until we get that kind of information back, it's going to be difficult to get closure here.
Okay.
I guess we can go further if you like.
We can get closer to that closure,
Well,
right?
let's go on.
So,
So we'll leave it at 7.5.
Okay, yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention that in the maybe 3 dozen or so agencies that I've worked with over time, I can only think of 2 agencies that don't have a capital reserve. Or I should say, they have funds in reserve, but they don't have a capital target. And that's only the Sweetwater Authority and the City of Orange, out of maybe 3 dozen agencies that I've worked with.
As you're saying that, I seem to remember that there is a problem in doing O&M, operations and maintenance, out of capital bonds. And
Yeah,
so
you're not
we'll have to see if in fact we can have that reserve because it's not, I think what we're contemplating is not having it as a reserve for future capital improvements. We're having it as a reserve for fixing interim problems. And
Maintenance.
that's considered operations and maintenance, so we may not be able to do that. But you know what, that's what we find out.
Okay.
Right, I don't think I was completely understanding what you were saying, but yes, you're not supposed to use debt funding for O&M.
Yeah.
Unless there's a way we can classify it as a capital. It's kind of like playing with block grant monies. You know, what's rehab versus replacement?
Don't talk about that.
Okay, so we have two questions left, and the biggest one is your capital. Okay, so, and then the one after that is your rate structure, the percent of fixed revenue that you want to collect. So right now, what you're looking at is your reserve balances if you were to do your full city CIP, which over 5 years is 36 million, and you only do 2.5% revenue adjustments. So what would it take? The natural next question is, what would it take to do the full city CIP? And I believe that's 10% revenue adjustment, 10, and then 7, 5, and
Now you put 56, there you go.
okay. Yeah. Nothing like using a new keyboard. Let me see, it's over here. It's 10, 7, 5, 5, and then after that it's a bunch of 5s thereafter. Okay. So I'll go back over here.
Is there a reason you're front-loading the numbers?
Yes, because this is just like compounding. If you wait to do rate increases, it simply means that your future rate increases need to be larger. So it's best to do, because the revenue increases compound on one another, you get away with slightly smaller increases earlier on.
Okay.
So 2, 7, 5, 5. Okay, so there's your revenue adjustments, and now I'm going to issue debt in fiscal year 2018 to the tune of, I think it's $16 million. Okay. Okay, so what are we saying here? We're saying if you implement rates that collect 10% more revenue next year, or I guess it would be this fiscal year, so maybe, I don't know if you can issue a bond in this fiscal year. We might be better to move it out, but let's say you can move really fast and you can issue a bond during this fiscal year for $16 million, and you increase your total revenue by 10%, then what this is saying is that, so here are your reserves. Remember, people were talking about, you have, it's 12 million in reserve. I think 10 is just capital, but then you have some for O&M, right? So you would actually, because of the bond, you would get more reserves, but then you're doing capital. So remember that target of 7.5%. Over the course of 5 years, if you execute all your projects, then you would be near that reserve goal of whatever it is, $4.2 million right there. So this is an option here, is if you want to do the full city CIP, which is $36 million, you have to raise your rates 10% and then 7% the year after, 5% the year after, and so on, and issue a $16 million bond. That would get you there. Okay, now let's just pause here for a second and let's go look at rates. Okay, so I'm going to go to the rate tab. And in this table right here, assuming 6 HCF, your current monthly, this is monthly and not bi-monthly, your current monthly bill is $60 and change. So the typical single-family residential bill, assuming 6 HCF for 1 month, would go from $60 to $68 and change. Okay, for an increase of 12%. Oh, we have another question to answer, and that is your fixed revenue.
Oh, because that rate was only the variable?
No, that's the total bill,
Oh, that was
which
the
is a
total.
function
Okay.
of your fixed charge and your volumetric
okay.
rate. But right now, I'm implementing, this is the column, right now you're collecting, it's that middle ground. You're collecting 45% of your revenue through a fixed charge. If you were to keep it at your, remember I said your current fixed revenue is 59%, the single family bill would be higher. So let's just go back to where you are now. So 80 So what I'm doing here, if you remember those buckets, I'm taking some costs from that green bucket and I'm collecting it through the fixed charge. So I'm loading your costs into the fixed charge right now when I'm playing with these numbers, just so you don't think it's hocus pocus. So now we're going back to the rates. Now, you see that? Because you're loading that fixed charge, it went to $71. So your current bill is $60 to $71. So now you can see, based on how you choose your rate structure to be, it's going to affect your typical single-family bill. I chose 45% to get you closer to the norm, but it's not this drastic change. You're not going from 60% all the way down to 30%. You know, there's benefits to having a high fixed charge. You can weather droughts, and of course, you know, the Fitches and the Moody's love stable revenue, so they might rate you higher if you have a high fixed revenue. So I didn't want to go from 60 all the way down to 30, thought it was a little abrupt, and I stopped at 45. But at this point, you know, please tell me where you think you would like to be. Do you want to stay where you are? Do you like the 45% fixed revenue? Would you like to be more like other agencies?
Well, so you're saying, okay, well, I'll start. So on the fixed cost, we have been at 59, and this actually proposes that the single-family residential goes to 45, or everything goes to 45% on the
No, that
fixed?
45% simply means that when you look in the totality of all your rates, you will collect 45% of your revenue through fixed charges, which, by the way, includes a private fire charge, which we're going to implement, but that's just a small amount of revenue. But 45% of your revenue will be not tied to how much people use. Okay? And in the end, that will produce for a single-family household, when you account that fixed charge and the volumetric use of 6 HCF, a typical bill will be $71.22.
Just for the water.
Yeah, well, their total bill, but for water, yes. But that's their total water bill. And if I go over here and I say, well, let's collect less of your revenue from a fixed charge, and I back this down to what it was before, which was, I think, 75 and 20.5. So I'm taking costs, this is 75 and 20.5. Okay, so now, so you were collecting 59% of your revenue through a fixed charge before. Now I just lowered that down to 45%. So now let's go back to the bill. You have a lower fixed charge. It went from 71 to 68. And I didn't point it out, but over here on the left, you have a graph of, this is use, water use on the bottom here. Okay? And if you use, 2 HCF or 4 HCF, your proposed bill is the blue. And because you have a tiered rate, you can see the slope is steeper. So the more you use, the more you're going to pay when you're out here around 14 HCF. These are your current rates, the bill produced by your current rates. You can see it's less steep. So now, just for educational purposes, I'm going to go back to the cost of service, and I'm going to say, well, let's say you were like most other agencies, and you only collected that's 4. That's why. Now you're collecting 30% of your revenue through a fixed charge, which is just about the average in Southern California. Let's go back and look at your rates. You see what happened to that blue line? It just dipped down here. The less you use, the less you pay. So it used to be up here. So if you chose to do this, it means that for low water users, their bill will actually go down a little bit. Those who use 2 HCF and 4 HCF will see a bill decrease because of that lower fixed charge. But you're still collecting the same amount of revenue at the end of the year. It's just how you're collecting it.
Would this apply then to the guy that was here earlier today talking about his water bill being so high while he was gone and not using any water? He would benefit from
Yes.
this.
Because he's not paying that fixed charge, right now
He's
it's
paying
about
the fixed.
60%.
He's only paying the fixed. He's not paying any,
That's, well, and we all
volumetric.
have, if, the same situation would apply to all of us. If we were to leave the country for 3 months, we're still getting charged a fixed rate.
fixed rate.
Right. In this example, that rate, the actual expense would come down to the ratepayer.
And if I may also, that individual uses only 1 or 2 units historically in a billing period. So his volume use is way low compared to the average single-family home. So, yes.
He would definitely benefit.
He is one of the few, because there's only 2 users of 4 units or less that would actually benefit from that. So it's really the users on the bottom end of the scale are the ones that would benefit the most.
You know, certainly looking at this chart, if you go down to some of the jumps that people see, like the 7562 current monthly bill, it will go up 28%. And it says that there's 87% of the bills at that
Yes,
rate.
that's correct. So Steve, I think you were talking about this point. This is saying that 45% of your bills go out for 4 HCF or less. So if you were to do this, lower your fixed charge, 45% of your customers, so to speak, would see a bill decrease. And that, was that? Okay.
Is that how you read it? Okay.
Which is a good amount.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, clearly in most jurisdictions, volumetric rates encourage conservation and all that. When this was set at the current percentage, we didn't have a lot of data on we were just new on meters. And it did provide us with predictability. And the question is now, if you're not proposing changing it a whole lot, so I think we're kind of okay, but I think there's still some question about looking at the makeup of Port Hueneme, a lot of apartments, a lot of condos, a lot of relatively low water users. Are we going to actually be able to maintain the same level of revenues? I mean, I know you're talking about just you're shifting percentages, but usage could very well go down.
Drop so much that we lose revenue.
Well,
from
that's
that.
the question: is what's the sweet spot? I guess.
Yeah.
And how do we know what it is?
Steve.
Well, if I may, that's the reason why we had a higher fixed value in our current rates is our first time around after we put the meters in, management at that time was concerned about the impact that installing meters would have on the revenues, and it had the potential to go through some major financial instability, some revenue streams that would change.
So what happened?
So one way to combat that is to have a higher fixed rate, and then the next year have a little bit lower, and then, because you build time for the people to get used to having meters and
Habit of using less water, and now build up the
right.
other way
And
around.
then now, if we were to do something like this, we have the potential now to a certain degree see the same impact, but maybe not as big. Maybe we have little or smaller waves of instability. However, if a drought comes in and demand reductions come in and more people do reduce, then the loss of revenue would be larger.
And I would comment on a few things there, is that 30% of your revenue is still fixed. And in this study, we are using your water use from fiscal year 2016. And then we're actually assuming that it stays flat. In 2016, we were just coming out of a drought, and it's actually likely that water use will creep up a little bit. But we're setting rates based on 2016, which is conservative, because if we used a slightly higher number, then your rate would go down, right? Because of cost over a volume. If your denominator is smaller, then your rate is higher. So we're being conservative because we're using fiscal year 2016 water use, when in actuality, it's likely to go up a little bit. And then people can only conserve so much. So even though we're saying 30% of your revenue is fixed, I mean, people still need indoor water use. I mean, you can't not use any water, right? So the only amount of water that's discretionary, for the most part, is, you know, you shorten your showers and you don't use any water outside, but you still have essential water needs. So some of your volumetric revenue is considered, you could consider it to be fixed because people can only cut back so much. So 30% is not a true picture of what you can count on, so to speak. It's closer to maybe like 50% or 60%. And then you have reserves too.
So what's our number?
So, we can talk about the CIP in terms of a longer collection period. You said 16 million, I'm assuming that's for the one-time large project, right?
Well, right now, we've got it on the full CIP, but there's other options. There's the AKM, which we haven't discussed yet, but I'm happy to go there. I'm just looking for some, what should we leave it at for now?
Because that would be for the total of 35 million, right? So you're saying that 16 million was the debt in order to get 35 on that other
Oh,
chart?
yes.
Yeah.
So you're funding 36 million of capital, but 16 through debt and the rest through rates.
Right.
Yeah, the master plan CIP I thought was realistic, and that's 19 million versus 33 over the 5 years. And I suppose the question is if we're bonding anyway, how much difference would it make to look at the full city CIP versus the master plan CIP? My concern, you know, I'll tell you, my concern basically is phase one, which I think is urgent, and you know, if the others, you know, the others can be spread over time or not, I guess, depending on how the financing goes.
Yeah, so that's a good question, is if you don't do the full city CIP, and I'm come up here and we choose to do the AKM Water Master Plan CIP, okay, that's 19 million over 5 years because of the timing of the projects. I plucked that right out of the Water Master Plan that Villafana went through earlier. Okay, so now you're doing, well, this is inflation adjusted, okay, 21 million. Now we'll get rid of the debt. Okay, and, okay, look at your reserve balances, nice. And now we'll decrease this to where we were before, 2.5%.
It's 2%.
Thank you.
Now it's 25%.
2.5. Okay. 2.5. Okay. So there. Now we got 2.5% total revenue adjustments. We have no debt. We have the AKM Water Master Plan. And what this is saying is that, yeah, you violate your target a little bit, but you could get by with doing the AKM Water Master Plan, 2.5% revenue adjustments, and no debt. This was actually my preferred option.
Well, then, I mean, we you know, we're talking about, you know, money being cheap right now. I mean, would we be better off acquiring debt anyway?
Well, so debt adds cost. There's no doubt about it, because you have interest rates and then you have the underwriter's discount, which isn't a discount at all. So total cost-wise, it costs more to use debt. But then there's the concept that we were talking about earlier, is intergenerational equity, is that you're spreading your costs over 30 years. Just like buying a car now with cash is cheaper than taking out a loan.
Sure.
But, you know, so there's pros and cons of debt, and certain city councils, like the City of Orange, do not want to hear or discuss the word debt. They just don't want any debt, but other places are more amenable to debt.
Well, I mean, there can be advantages or not.
Exactly.
And I think that's the question. So under this scenario, can we click on the rate screen?
Yeah, so now we'll look at rates. Okay, so this is with the 45%, no, this is the 30% fixed revenue. Okay, so in this case, okay, your typical bill is 60 bucks. It actually goes down a hair. Is that 58.85? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so your average single-family customer would see a small decrease of $1.57 a month. But this is with a change in your rate structure, right? Now your fixed revenue is lower. Has everyone got that? Because if I go back to where you're currently collecting 60% fixed revenue, this is going to go up.
And that's still, and this is still funding the master plan CIP.
Yes, it's still collecting the total amount of revenue. It's just collecting it differently. Look at the graph on the right here. You're charging more as soon as
And funding the AKM master plan, 19 million.
You're charging more to those who use more water. Here's your average at 6. You can see the pivot point is 6, and less to those who use less water. And again, we all have to take a grain of salt. This is a model, so it has assumptions in it with inflation and assumed water use, like I said, for fiscal year 2016. So it is a model, but with all those assumptions, those who use less pay less.
So it's a virtuous incentive.
It incentivizes conservation, yes. And so just to show you, I'm going to go back here and put it to where you are now, which is 80 and 66. So now you're collecting 60%, 59, and now we're going to go back to rates, and $60 to $66, okay, because of that fixed charge. See, so you see the blue line is always above the red line, which is your current rates. And you're still funding the AKM Water Master Plan.
Why don't you do a quick scenario at a 40% fixed rate?
Yeah, the 45
and everything
in
else
the
staying
middle.
the same.
Or 45.
I'd be interested in 40. Yeah, let's see what that looks like.
Okay,
It gives
so-
us a little more.
Okay, so that would be,
You just put 38.
yeah. No, I'm looking right here. This is your percent fixed revenue.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So, let's see, 75, so 70, 37, 38, let's go 76, maybe a hair more, there. Okay, that's just about 40%, and $60 to $63.
So their average user goes up a little bit in that scenario, about a 4%.
Yeah.
So, do you want to review again each of the assumptions here so that we can?
So there's 5, I believe.
Okay.
And I think you've made at least final decisions on 2. So the 5 are RO on or off,
Off.
okay, and that's an off. Debt service, whether to leave it as it is,
We couldn't decide that.
and right now what we're looking at is, we didn't touch debt service. Everything you've seen so far, we have not touched debt service.
Right. Next one was capital reserve.
Right, your reserves, what do you want for a reserve goal?
7.5, I thought, is what we had.
Right, we have 7.5% right now. And that affects this red line right here. Okay, so if we were to drop that, then you could maybe, I've got 2.5% here, you could maybe go with 2% because that red line has dropped a little bit. Okay, so, what else? The CIP. And then the last one is your rate structure, how much to collect from the fixed charge. Those are the 5 decisions that you essentially, in order for us to nail this down and then go to the public and put some rates in front of them, telling them this is what your rates are going to be, these questions need to be answered.
And that's what we just were looking at with the blue and red lines.
I'm sorry, your question is what?
Previous slide that was showing how the rate structure, go back to there on the right.
Yeah, so this is water use, your bill with different levels of water use.
Yes,
But right
that's
now,
the
we've
rate
made,
structure.
this is the 40% fixed revenue rate structure that Mr. Butler asked for.
I can live with that.
Okay, so I think these numbers, well, before we can sign off, we want to see the whole package because there still are some of these questions, bonding as being one, questions of the impact of the general fund if we do reduce the outstanding balance and recast the loan. And then there were a series of questions I had regarding a capital improvement program, and some of those things, particularly those, excuse me, but what's included in the $20 million? What are the capital projects included in that?
It is basically, I'll go to it right now, it is the first, it is projects, let's just say maybe 1 through 6 of the water, AKM
6 of
water
the
master
priorities.
plan.
That's a lot.
Okay, but some of those priorities, I think, had another useful life that extended
Had some.
beyond this 5-year period.
Which we may not have
And
to get
so
to
I
then.
would like to be able to see if we can, amortize it further out.
Okay, here it is. This is your AKM water master plan. And like Mr. Villafana was going through with you today, he was talking about, I guess it's 8 projects. Okay, and I just assume that you're picking them off every year. So in fiscal year 18, you do project number 1. In fiscal year 2019, you do project 2, and so on down the line. So that's the AKM water master plan right there.
Over a what? Sure. 9-year period?
Yeah, I think, we've got kind of, there again, an engineering question. I think phase 1 is some urgency, and I think I'd like to see that started. But as far as some of the others, I mean, they could probably slide to the right without harm. And, but there again, that there's some assessments that have to be made, for us to make a real decision on that.
Well, for instance, I see here, could you scoot that over? Thank you. Is it project number 3 is about almost $4 million, and yet what I see here is that there's an estimated useful life of 2035. So my question is, when we set up priorities, should we also be looking at useful life?
Those priorities can probably change then per staff's recommendations.
So I think that I'd much rather see these numbers continue to come down and to match our cash needs with the actual, matching it with the system requirements. And
But wasn't it where these numbers are 2011 numbers?
Yes.
Yeah, so we might
Unless-
have to adjust a few?
Well, you
or-
might, but the point being is
We've
that.
accounted for inflation in here.
We
Pardon?
did.
These numbers account for
are they?
inflation.
Oh,
So we
okay.
took the
Okay.
2011 AKM and adjusted them for inflation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the question is, does it need to be done in 2020, or can it be done in 2023 or 2025?
Correct.
Are we, what reliability issues are we risking, by putting it off a couple more years? And if we spread it out over a longer period of time, then, the annual cost, spreads out as well.
Well, one of the counterbalances is that we're going to have a accumulated reserve, capital reserve. So if you push some of the projects out that are less priority or critical importance, you still have funds available to fix those systems if they break.
Can
So-
I also add two? Oh,
Comment, Bill. All these, he's had them picked off 1 year at a time. Realistically, they're not going to go that quickly, So just the nature of it, I would stretch those out. We've got 8 projects and he's picking them off 1 year at a time just because of the process of design and construction.
Maybe 2 years at a time or something.
More realistic. So that would amortize it over a further period of time, and we could look at, that would be stretching it out longer towards that 2035.
Okay, well,
Do we then drop the discussion entirely of what our city attorney had talked about, and that was the intergenerational equity, and actually get into debt so that it's not just the today and now paying for this infrastructure change, but those of the future having, skin in the game as well.
That would be the bond issue then.
Yeah, and the money is really cheap too, so could we factor in at least some of the money this way? So we don't hit the current.
well, it doesn't hurt to run the model with that kind of scenario.
Because if you have this formula already built in, I would like to put some of this into a debt scenario versus just simply just on the current ratepayer. The current ratepayer is going to pay for the debt anyway, but it moves the time frame out in terms of how we pay it back.
Yeah, well, you would just need to know what the cost was, because you say of course there was a cost. And if we're going to bond, we could look at the full city CIP at that point. I don't know if there would be that much difference in cost over, 30 years, or could we do it for 40? I don't know.
Full city, okay, but you'd have a different source of repayment for that. It'd actually be a different bond, I think.
Yeah, so, I don't know. I'm actually rather pleased with where this is going. I think it's better than I thought it was going to be. We can, I suppose we could get a model with some bond financing in there and see what difference it makes. I don't know that we need to do it though, so.
Well, not for making this decision. I don't think we need to do that. We can agree to this and still go after bond issues.
So my thinking is that Mr. Villafana and perhaps Mr. Green ought to put their heads together along with I believe you're the interim finance director. I'm Tom. Haven't met you yet.
Something you want to say, Ken?
Would you fill out a speaker's phone?
The one thing when they were talking about the fixed cost component, some of the things I don't know about the makeup of the community. I've been in some communities where you'll have a high usage of water and a high, everybody's coming, like tourists. I worked in a ski resort. So from November through March, you had a ton of people coming in that area, and then that dropped off in the summer months. So by having a higher fixed cost component, that leveled it out through the year and kind of addressed those periods. I've also been in areas in Arizona that had a lot of snowbirds. So from October, through May, there was a lot of people there, and then vacant units in the summer. So it was kind of a way of stabilizing those rates and kind of having them pay for them being part-time residents to equal the people that are here all the time. I think he was addressing them in the capacity kind of issues, but it might be the type of thing, rather than going from a drastic high fixed cost to a low one, kind of maybe work it in the middle so it kind of evens it out, keeps everybody's rates a little bit more stable. But then when you have that volumetric rate, you could see somebody that has large increases in their bill monthly. And then the financing, all that, if you can, get a reduced cost of interest. I think it's the general fund loan to the water utility. That's unusual. Usually it's the other way around, but the general fund has a secured loan in lending it to them. If you got a cheaper rate that would be better for the water utility, the general fund losing that 5% interest, it's not that hard to get a long-term investment that will get that. Now, if you wanted that liquid so you could use it right away, a 5% earning on that is going to be real rare. Like the LAIF rate since at least 2008 has been 4.5 or less, and it's been going down and down and down. Who knows what the interest rates will come in the future, but I think getting a long-term low fixed rate right now is going to be pretty rock solid, because the internal Fed rate that they loaned to banks was almost, they were just giving the money away. They can't keep that up, and now we're starting to see some inflation because they were artificially holding it down for the last few years to try and keep that at bay. So getting a low fixed rate right now will help us in the long run. You can make up for some of that revenue that you'd lose in the general fund, but that money would be just as committed as it was being loaned to the water utility. And then if you combine some of those things, you can get cheaper underwriting costs, but there's kind of a mix that you have to be in there too.
Well, you just complicated our lives.
Sorry, some of these things, I'd be able to probably answer right off the cuff if I had more detail about the community and all that type of stuff. My feeling is that we have more people here in the summer than we do in the winter, but that may just be from the 3 or 4 hotels that we have.
Well, wouldn't your data have that kind of information as to the peaks and the
Probably
valleys?
maybe the overall use data of what, like how many gallons are coming into the city every month. That would probably indicate if you had twice as many gallons being used in July as you do now, and really you don't have a high landscaping and irrigation need, then that's probably based on, crowds, people, kids coming home for the summer and that type of stuff.
Right, and our data only has production numbers. It doesn't really incorporate population changes from winter to summer or weekend to weekday.
Okay, so join the team. We have a couple of questions here about how to treat our CIP, how to finance it, how to spread it out, how to maybe reprioritize some of these things. I still would like to have some information regarding the emergency backup potential, because that could greatly reduce our expense. And that's also a legal question as to our exposure, if that's something that we end up gravitating to. We want to take a look at the general fund and what the options are if we do choose to refinance the outstanding debt and then look at a lower rate, the 2.87 rate. Is there anything else that we asked to have?
Yeah, I think
Is that enough information to work with? Are you looking for more?
He'd like our current debt service.
Yeah, if I may. We've asked the consultant to do additional analysis to get us to this point. He's here today for a workshop that I basically called or requested for past discussions that we've had. He's here today in lieu of the public meeting now that was in his contract. So, and we haven't gotten to that point yet. So basically we've used up the budget with the number of council meetings and the amount of research and development of the model that was proposed. And so now that we're still not to that point, we probably need to look at a change order. So
yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, ultimately the council has to decide, but it's water enterprise fund money. I think we're making good progress. We don't want to take advantage of the consultant. So throw together a little change order for
I think these issues are far too important to worry about. Let's fix whatever it takes to get the contracts to accommodate the additional work we're looking for. Okay. And then I don't know, there was going to be a public meeting in addition to or before Prop 218?
Correct.
Okay. I still think that's valuable, is to have, and not just, wipe that off the slate.
And getting to this point, he probably now has a better idea of how much more time would be involved, and possibly even a better handle on the schedule of if we get to a certain point, when would we expect the public hearing, when would we expect a 218 if we went that route. Then so I'll rely on him to provide me that information. I'll put it into a staff report or a change order and provide you that information.
Okay. And I prefer a 30% fixed, not 40.
I like the 40. Provides more predictability.
Well, but
Yeah,
that's what kind of spiked our rates to begin with. And I just,
Yeah, that's just my nervous Nelly city manager of going from where we're kind of high now, let's admit it, but going all the way down to 30, it makes me a little bit nervous in terms of the predictability of our revenue stream. But as with everything else, it's a council call.
well, I'd like to see a number that's actually less than what our ratepayers are paying now. And
And it-
so, I think I'd like to gravitate to that, so.
Well, the number that we just ended with here, if we go to the rates, I think it affects 45% of our bills, which is a really good percentage of people that would see something lower.
Well, I mean, again, you're going to be kind of reformulating the CIP, programming and scheduling, and so we're going to have to see the whole thing. And maybe, you want to do a 40 and a 30, fine, because there's still a lot of numbers here that need to be,
Sure.
reformulated. All right, I'm brain dead. Anybody want to talk? Open forum. No, I'm not going to invite you back. All right, so is there any comments, questions you want to leave with before we adjourn?
I
Oh.
have one, if I may. Just conferring with the consultant. At this point, I asked if there was any additional homework or review that needed to be done. At this point, he says he's given you the information that you need. It'll be up to the council now to make the decisions that they need to have based on these discussions. So that's a good thing. I thank you all for getting us to this point. It took a few discussions, took some clarification on a few points, but we got here, and I think we'll be able to come up with a product for council here real soon. And I believe we're scheduled to bring this back to council on the 20th. Do you think that we'll be in a position to do that on the 20th, or do we need more time?
That's pretty ambitious because the agenda goes out Thursday of this week. So to pull together all of the.
Hence my request. Do we have a date that we would like to maybe have this brought back?
First meeting in December?
Yeah, we got 2 December meetings, the 4th and the 18th. We'd shoot for the 4th. I'm pretty sure we will have a full council that night.
You're trying to think of your schedule, is that what you're?
Well, I'm actually just trying to think of, let me just explain how I see it. I mean, in terms of the model, it's built and it's constructed. I feel as though now I need still some decisions, obviously, because the 5 special questions haven't all been nailed down. So we need to nail those down. And then there were some issues about possibly moving this AKM CIP out a couple of years. I just need to know, the time frame, if you're going to slip it by a couple of years. So I need to know what you're thinking for that. So I need information from the city. And then I guess I also need a decision, because the model right now is saying that if you did the AKM CIP as it stands right now, you would not have to issue debt. And I heard some people saying, well, we should issue debt. So I guess we would need to know how much.
No, I understand. There's
when.
information we need to feed to you.
Yes.
I understand that
Feed me.
entirely. That's our responsibility to get that to you.
Okay, because I don't feel as though, as of right now, there's nothing more that I can do.
I understand. You need to be on standby, so when the numbers come your way,
Right.
you can work your magic.
And lastly, I just wanted to mention too, while you were talking about it, is it doesn't surprise me that the prior staff and the prior consultant chose to have such a high fixed charge, because you were installing meters, and when you install meters, that greatly affects your water use. So nobody knows how that was going to turn out, so they played it safe and said, well, let's still continue to collect a high level of fixed charge. We did that for the Sacramento, we did it for the city of Shafter, and it's typically what you would do when an agency is getting metered.
And Bartle Wells was adamant about doing that, starting off with a brand-new rate structure. a volumetric rate structure.
So now that you've been metered for a while, it's the time to consider, hey, is 60% the right number for us?
Right. Down to 45.
30 sounds good.
We will review the CIP and provide a more realistic schedule of phasing it, which will certainly slide it out several years. So I will get back to you on that in the next week or so.
Okay.
All right. I think I'll adjourn while we're ahead. And next Monday.